Welcome to Quiet Chronicles. There are years in history that do not announce themselves with a battle, a coronation, or the fall of a city. They arrive more strangely than that. A summer feels wrong. The light seems weakened. Crops hesitate in the fields. People look upward and find that the sun, the one thing every village and kingdom depended on without question, has begun to behave as if something has come between the world and its warmth. The year was 536 AD, and across parts of Europe and beyond, writers remembered a dimmed sky, failed seasons, hunger, fear, and a cold that seemed to unsettle the ordinary rhythm of life. For people living after Rome's Western Empire had broken apart, this was not a distant climate event. It entered homes through bread, roofs, animals, taxes, roads, churches, and the fragile routines that kept a household alive. If you enjoy these long historical journeys, a quiet like and subscription helps the channel keep publishing each week. And tell us in the comments where you are listening from tonight, or what person, topic, story, or era you would like Quiet Chronicles to cover next. Before Europe had words for climate systems, volcanic veils, or atmospheric dust, it had fields, prayers, granaries, and witnesses trying to describe a year when daylight itself seemed unreliable. Chapter 1. A darkened year begins. A year can enter history through a crown, a campaign, a treaty, or the death of a ruler. The year 536 entered through the sky. In the Eastern Roman world, where Justinian ruled from Constantinople, and officials still measured power in laws, taxes, armies, and grain, one of the strangest notices of the 6th century was recorded by Procopius, a writer who had seen the imperial court and followed the wars of Belisarius. He wrote that the sun gave its light without brightness, like the moon, for much of the year. The sentence is brief, but it has the weight of someone trying to describe an ordinary thing that had stopped feeling ordinary. Procopius was not writing from some isolated edge of the world. He belonged to the educated Greek-speaking world of the Eastern Empire, where the old Roman state had not vanished, and where scribes, commanders, courtiers, monks, merchants, and bishops still moved inside a dense system of offices and obligations. Justinian's government was ambitious, expensive, and restless. It built churches, issued laws, sent armies westward, and tried to pull old imperial territories back toward Constantinople. Against that background, the dimming of the sun was not a poetic decoration in a chronicle. It was a disturbance placed inside a world already under pressure. Modern science gives that old sentence another frame. Tree rings from the middle of the 6th century grow narrow in many places, because trees record hard seasons in their wood with a patience no human witness can match. Ice cores preserve traces of volcanic material, and climate reconstructions point toward a major atmospheric event beginning in 536, followed by further eruptions in the years after. The likely cause was volcanic aerosol high in the atmosphere, spreading a veil that reflected sunlight and cooled the surface below. The exact volcano remains debated, but the evidence for severe cooling is no longer carried by one writer alone. For people alive at the time, there was no language of aerosol layers, hemispheric circulation, or volcanic sulfate. There was the fact of a summer that did not behave. Fields needed warmth at the proper hour of the year. Vines, grain, fruit trees, vegetable plots, hay meadows, and pasture all depended on the old bargain between daylight and growth. A peasant did not need to understand the upper air to know that a crop was late, a stalk thin, or a field less generous than it should have been. The calendar had marks for saints, taxes, sowing, cutting, fasting, and feast days. The weather had begun to answer those marks poorly. Across later Syriac and Byzantine traditions, the memory of the dimmed sun lingered with a peculiar force. Michael the Syrian, writing long afterward from sources available to him, preserved accounts of a darkened sun and troubled seasons, while John of Ephesus, closer to the 6th century Eastern Christian world, belonged to the same broad atmosphere of recorded catastrophe and explanation. These writers were not climate scientists in the modern sense, but they were careful enough to preserve what communities had considered worth remembering. A strange sun, once entered into historical memory, did not easily disappear from it. One of the notable things about 536 is that it did not strike a strong, unified Europe. The Western Roman Empire had already come apart in the previous century, leaving its roads, cities, legal habits, bishops, landed families, and memories scattered among new kingdoms. In Italy, Ostrogothic rule rested over Roman administrative habits. In Gaul, Frankish kings were building power through conquest, marriage, oath, and church alliance. In Britain, Roman administration had faded into a more local and fragmentary world. The sky darkened over lands where authority itself had become uneven. Constantinople still imagined itself as the Roman center of the world. From its palaces and offices, Justinian's rule stretched through taxation, law, diplomacy, and war, and his general Belisarius was already one of the great instruments of that policy. North Africa had been taken back from the Vandals only a few years before. Italy would soon become the great field of imperial return and suffering, as the Gothic War drew soldiers, civilians, cities, and food supplies into years of strain. The cold year did not create all this conflict, but it entered the same crowded room. In a village or small estate, the first signs of trouble would not have needed announcement. Grain ripened by degrees, and every stage mattered. A weak season could reduce the height of the stalk, the fullness of the ear, the dryness needed before storage, and the amount of seed that could be held back for the next sowing. Hay mattered almost as much as bread, because animals carried wealth in their bodies and required fodder through the cold months. A household with less grain could still fear the loss of an ox, because without the animal, the next year's field became harder to break. No single source can show every farmstead under the dim sky. The record is not built that way. It is stronger in courts, churches, monasteries, laws, letters, chronicles, and the traces left in wood, bone, pollen, soil, and stone. Yet those records are enough to show the shape of dependence. The harvest was never only a harvest. It was rent for the landholder, tax for the state where taxation still reached, offering for the church, seed for the next year, fodder for animals, bread for children and elders, and security against the unknown length of winter. A colder summer also changed the meaning of distance. Roads still crossed Europe, many of them inherited from Rome, but travel depended on food, animals, weather, and local safety. A messenger carrying letters between bishops or officials might still move along old routes, but the cost of feeding pack animals rose when fodder was scarce. Merchants needed goods worth carrying and buyers able to pay. Soldiers needed supply more than courage, and a column without grain became a burden on the country it crossed. Even movement had to pass through the harvest. Religious explanation came naturally because the 6th century world did not divide weather, morality, and divine order into separate compartments. A strange sky could be read as warning, punishment, sign, or summons to repentance. Bishops did not merely offer private consolation, they organized public meaning. Sermons, fasts, processions, almsgiving, and prayers gave communities a way to respond together when the ordinary language of farming and trade could not explain what had happened. The church calendar continued to turn, and the altered seasons pressed themselves into its days. At the same time, the crisis was not experienced everywhere in the same measure. A port city, a mountain settlement, a monastery with stores, a royal estate, a poor tenant household, and a bishop's town did not meet scarcity from the same position. Some regions may have endured the cooling with more resilience than others. Stored grain, access to trade, political protection, livestock holdings, woodland resources, and local charity all mattered. Disaster in the 6th century was rarely a flat surface laid evenly over everyone. The word often attached to this period, Dark Age, can mislead if it suggests a world without intelligence or structure. The Europe of 536 was not empty, silent, or waiting to be rediscovered. It had laws, rulers, saints, scribes, traders, farmers, craftsmen, ships, coins, courts, monasteries, and families with long memories. Its darkness, where darkness appeared, belonged partly to the sky and partly to the poverty of surviving evidence in some regions. The people themselves lived inside full and demanding worlds. Still, the phrase holds one uncomfortable truth when handled carefully. The year 536 made darkness literal enough for writers to notice it. The sun's weakened light became a historical fact because it disturbed the systems that trusted the sun without thinking about it. Food production, authority, worship, movement, and memory all bent around the same pressure. A ruler in Constantinople and a cultivator in Gaul would not have described the year in the same terms, but both lived in worlds where the season mattered more than any decree. What followed was not a single year of trouble neatly ending when the calendar turned. The cooling of 536 opened into a harsher sequence of years, with further volcanic disturbance around 540 and 547, and a broader cold period that modern scholars call the Late Antique Little Ice Age. Then, in 541, plague began moving through the eastern Mediterranean world, entering societies already touched by war, hunger, and climatic stress. History rarely arranges its disasters politely, one at a time. The beginning, though, was the altered light. Before the later plague, before the long memory of famine, before scholars counted tree rings and read ice cores, there was the simple report that the sun had shone without strength. From that weakened brightness, the year spread into bread, fields, houses, roads, churches, and the guarded stores that stood between a household and hunger. The next part of that life begins with the most ordinary food in Europe, and with what happened when the grain behind it became uncertain. Chapter 2. Bread under a cold sky. Bread carried the year into the body. A dimmed sun could be described by a chronicler, discussed by a bishop, or remembered in the margin of a later history. But for most households, its meaning arrived through grain. Wheat, barley, rye, oats, millet, and whatever local crop a field could support stood between a family and the months when the ground gave little back. When the warmth failed or the light weakened, the change did not remain in the sky. It settled into the sack, the bin, the oven, and the guarded portion kept aside for seed. Across much of Europe, bread was not a single food with a single form. In better connected towns, Wheat bread could mark higher status, especially where trade and estate supply brought cleaner flour into the hands of those who could afford it. In poorer rural places, barley, rye, oats, mixed grains, beans, peas, and rougher meal mattered more. The loaf could be dark, dense, coarse, and heavy in the hand, sometimes stretched with whatever was available when grain ran short. A household did not need fine bread to survive, but it needed something that could be stored, divided, carried, and eaten when work left little time for preparation. Italy gives one of the clearest administrative windows into this world because Cassiodorus, serving the Ostrogothic kings, left a collection of official letters that show government as a daily labor of supply, petition, favor, repair, and instruction. His writing belongs to a courtly register, polished and Roman in habit. Yet beneath the elegance there is the practical statecraft of grain, taxes, ships, officials, and cities that needed to be fed. In the decades around 536, Italy stood between old Roman administrative memory and the realities of Gothic rule. Officials still wrote as if order could be maintained through letters, commands, exemptions, and careful supervision. Cassiodorus's letters do not give a peasant's private diary of a failed field. They give something different and still valuable. The view from above of a society where food supply remained a political duty. A king who could not move grain, restrain abuse, protect cultivators, or keep cities provisioned lost more than revenue. He lost the appearance of care. In a hungry year, administrative language could become a form of reassurance, because the state wished to show that it still had hands reaching into the problem. A letter sealed and sent across a district did not fill a granary by itself. Grain began as labor long before it became bread. Fields had to be prepared with wooden plows, often strengthened by iron fittings, and the quality of the soil depended on manure, weather, timing, and repeated use. Seed was a dangerous treasure because it was food that had to remain uneaten. When harvests were ordinary, a household or estate could divide the yield between immediate consumption, rent, tax, fodder, sale, and next year's planting. Under a poor sky, the same categories remained, but the amounts inside them shrank. A failed harvest rarely meant that nothing grew anywhere. More often, it meant that the normal margin disappeared. The stalks might stand thinner, the ears might fill poorly, the grain might dry badly, or the yield might prove too small after threshing. Damp conditions could spoil stored crops, and a cold growing season could delay ripening until the next weather risk arrived. One field's disappointment became a household's calculation, then an estate's problem, then a market's pressure. Scarcity moved outward from the grain head to the whole structure of obligation. Milling made the harvest usable, and even that step required effort, tools, and sometimes payment. Hand mills and larger mills turned grain into meal, while sieving separated finer flour from coarser material where the means existed. In many rural households, grinding could be a repeated domestic labor, slow enough to make bread feel less like an object and more like accumulated time. An estate or monastery with better equipment had an advantage before the loaf reached the oven. The stone that crushed the grain belonged to the same story as the weather that weakened it. Storage was another form of survival. Grain could be kept in bins, pits, chests, jars, barns, or granaries depending on region, wealth, and building practice. Dryness mattered, rodents mattered, theft mattered. So did the authority to decide when the store could be opened. A rich landholder, a monastery, a royal estate Or a city administration might possess reserves beyond the reach of a poor tenant, and those reserves could make the difference between charity, sale, ration, or command. The food existed in a physical place, behind a door or inside a container. During a year of bad growth, the poor met scarcity first because they owned the smallest buffer. A free peasant with some land, a dependent tenant, a laborer, a widow attached to charity, a town artisan buying grain, and a servant in a larger household did not share the same protection. People with animals could draw on milk, cheese, or meat in some circumstances, but animals also consumed fodder and represented future labor. To slaughter an ox in hunger was to solve one problem by damaging another season. Hunger often forced choices that made tomorrow poorer. Churches and monasteries stood close to this economy because they received gifts, rents, tithes in later forms, offerings, and the produce of their own lands. Bishops were not only spiritual figures in this setting. They could intercede, distribute alms, organize relief, protect church property, and speak in moral language about the obligations of the wealthy. A sermon against greed or hoarding had a practical edge when grain was short. The poor heard theology through the stomach when bread failed. The 6th century world understood famine through both material and moral registers. Bad weather could be treated as divine warning, but human failure still mattered inside that explanation. Hoarding, unjust taxation, corrupt officials, careless landowners, and the refusal to give alms could all be folded into the meaning of scarcity. This gave the crisis a social language. If the fields failed, people still asked who possessed stores, who controlled prices, who owed protection, and who had neglected mercy. The granary became a moral object as well as a wooden or stone one. Market dependence made the situation sharper in towns. A rural household might have direct access to grain if it held land, though direct access did not guarantee enough food. A town worker relied more heavily on price, availability, wages, and supply routes. When grain moved badly or became expensive, a city could feel the crisis with particular force. Bakers, millers, carriers, officials, and merchants formed a chain, and each link added its own cost or vulnerability. Bread in a town carried the road inside it. In the old Roman world, grain supply had once been one of the great arts of government. Cities such as Rome and Constantinople depended on organized flows of food from large producing regions. By the 6th century, the Western arrangements had changed greatly, but the memory and fragments of that system remained. Italy still had cities that expected provisioning, officials who thought in inherited administrative terms, and elites who understood that food could keep peace or expose weakness. Cassiodorus's official world belongs to that inheritance, even when the older empire in the West no longer existed. A cold year would also alter what people considered edible. The record rarely preserves the full household detail, but the logic of pre-modern scarcity is clear enough. Coarser grains became more important when finer ones failed. Beans, peas, nuts, roots, preserved greens, dairy, dried fruit, and woodland resources could stretch the diet where available. In harsher circumstances, famine foods entered the picture, though the pros need not linger over private suffering to recognize the pressure. The meal became rougher before it vanished. Food preparation followed fuel, and fuel followed labor. An oven required heat, a hearth required wood, charcoal, peat, brush, or dried dung where people used it. Cold weather increased the demand for warmth. At the same time, poor harvests increased the value of every hour spent gathering. cutting, hauling, drying, and storing. Bread baking could be communal in some places, domestic in others, tied to manor, monastery, town, or household. A loaf contained the field, the mill, the fuel pile, and the oven mouth. Children, elders, the sick, and those without strong claims on a household's resources stood nearest to danger when food thinned. A family could reduce portions unevenly, sell small possessions, borrow, seek charity, enter service, move toward a town, or attach itself more tightly to a patron. None of these responses belonged only to 536, but a climate shock made them more likely and more urgent. Scarcity pressed people toward dependence because dependence at least offered a door to knock on. A powerful household with stores could gather more power simply by having bread when others did not. As the dim year lengthened, bread became a measure of trust. Trust in the field, trust in stored grain, trust in rulers, trust in patrons, trust in God's mercy, trust in next year's sowing. The loaf on a table or in a worker's hand was small, but the systems behind it were large and fragile. A bad sky did not need to destroy all of them at once. It only needed to reduce the margin until every obligation became harder to meet. That is why the history of 536 cannot remain above the clouds. The darkened sun matters because it changed what could be harvested, stored, ground, baked, sold, given, owed, and eaten. The first crisis of the year was light, but the second was grain. From there, the cold entered the places where people tried to keep themselves alive through the night and through the season, under roofs of timber, thatch, tile, smoke, wool, and guarded warmth. Chapter 3: Homes built against a longer winter. A house in 6th century Europe was never just a place to sleep. It was a storehouse, a workshop, a shelter for tools, a place where food was guarded, and often the nearest defense against weather that could not be negotiated with. In the year 536, when light weakened and seasons lost some of their ordinary reliability, the home became more important because the world beyond it had become less predictable. A poor harvest could be counted in grain, but cold entered through gaps in walls, wet fuel, thin bedding, and the slow wearing out of everything that kept warmth close. Across the former Western Roman provinces, homes differed sharply by region, wealth, and local inheritance. Some elite families still lived among the remains of Roman villas, with masonry, tiles, storerooms, and old habits of household management attached to land. In many rural settlements, timber, wattle, daub, thatch, turf, and reused stone carried ordinary life. A wall might be made by weaving branches between upright posts, then packing the frame with clay and straw until it could hold back wind well enough for the season. If rain found its way through the roof, the whole house felt it. Roman buildings did not vanish the moment imperial administration weakened. In Gaul, Italy, Britain, and parts of the Rhineland, stone walls, roof tiles, bath structures, roads, and estate buildings remained as materials and memories. Some were maintained, some were altered, and some became quarries for later use. A rural family might live near masonry raised under a different political order while depending on wooden repairs made by local hands. The old empire could be present as a wall stone in a smaller house. Cold-made building materials matter with a seriousness that modern comfort can hide. Thatch kept off weather if it was thick, well laid, and repaired, but it could rot, slip, burn, or admit damp where neglected. Timber had to be cut, shaped, joined, and protected from decay. Earth floors could be swept and packed, but in wet weather they carried damp into the body. Smoke from a central hearth could preserve roof timbers and repel insects, yet it also filled interiors when ventilation was poor. Warmth came with smoke, ash, and work. In poorer dwellings, the hearth was the center not because it was picturesque, but because it solved several problems at once. It heated, cooked, dried, lit, and gathered people near the same small source. Fuel might come from woodland, brush, peat, charcoal, pruned branches, or other local resources, and each kind carried its own labor. A cold year increased the value of a dry fuel stack. Wood that had not seasoned properly gave less heat and more smoke, leaving a room dim even before the sky outside was considered. Clothing formed another wall around the body. Linen could be worn close to the skin, while wool gave warmth in cloaks, tunics, blankets, and wraps. Leather shoes or simple footwear mattered in mud and frost, though surviving evidence is uneven and depends heavily on preservation. A wool cloak was not a costume detail in such a world. It was portable shelter, bedding, weather protection, and status all at once, depending on its quality and the person who wore it. When sheep suffered, clothing and food were connected through the same animal. Benedict of Nursia belongs to this chapter because his rule, written for monks in the 6th century, turns spiritual life into a practical order of hours: clothing, sleep, labor, food, discipline, and shared property. The rule of Benedict is not a household manual for all Europe, but it preserves a sharp sense of how bodies and communities had to be managed through the year. Monks were assigned clothing according to climate and need. They slept under regulation, ate under regulation, worked under regulation, and moved through a day shaped by prayer and necessity. The rule's calmness is part of its power. It assumes that survival and obedience both require order. A monastery could offer forms of protection that scattered households did not possess. It might have storerooms, gardens, workshops, livestock, books, tools, and a disciplined labor force. It also had rules for distribution, hierarchy, silence, hospitality, and punishment. In a colder, hungrier sequence of years, such institutions could become islands of relative organization, though not immunity. Monks still needed harvests, roofs, fuel, and healthy animals. Prayer did not replace the granary. Domestic storage was one of the hidden arts of survival. Grain had to be kept dry, but so did beans, peas, nuts, herbs, salt fish where available, cured meat, cheese, tools, kindling, and cloth. Storage containers could be wooden chests, ceramic jars, baskets, pits, shelves, or sacks, depending on place and means. The better a household could separate damp from food, rodents from grain, and theft from stores, the longer it could endure a poor season. A sealed container could mean several more weeks of ordinary meals. Animals often shared the human world more closely than modern habits suggest. In some regions and structures, livestock might be housed near or beneath human living spaces, or brought close to reduce exposure and theft. This was not only a matter of warmth, though animal heat could help where arrangements allowed it. It was also protection of value. A cow, pig, goat, sheep, or ox represented food, labor, manure, milk, wool, traction, breeding, and future security. Losing an animal in winter could echo into spring. The arrangement of space inside a home reflected work rather than privacy. Sleeping, cooking, repairing tools, spinning, storing food, tending children, and sheltering small animals could press against one another in close quarters. Light came from fire, doorways, small openings, lamps where fuel and means allowed, and the day itself. When the day's light weakened, indoor work did not become impossible, but it became more dependent on fuel and timing. A dim season could shorten the useful hours of tasks already shaped by labor. For women, servants, children, and older members of the household, the home could be both protection and burden. Much of the daily work of keeping a family alive happened there. Grinding, cooking, mending, drying, cleaning, tending, preserving, and stretching what stores remained. Written sources often name rulers and bishops more readily than the hands that did this work, but the structure of survival makes their labor unavoidable. A household did not pass through crisis because one person endured it heroically. It passed through crisis because repeated tasks continued. A colder year also changed the value of repair. A loose roof edge, a cracked pot, a worn shoe, a broken hinge, a torn cloak, a leaking storage jar, or a damaged fence mattered more when replacement was difficult. Repair preserved not only objects but options. The person who could mend a tool, patch a garment, rethatch a section of roof, or keep a door against weather extended the life of the household's small defenses. Crisis made skill visible. Some homes had stronger protection because they belonged to stronger systems. An estate center could command labor and collect produce. A monastery could organize work and stores under rule. A bishop's complex might receive gifts and control distribution. A royal or aristocratic household could draw supplies from dependent lands. Poorer households, by contrast, lived closer to the edge of each failure. The same winter could be an inconvenience in one building and a danger in another. Yet even wealth did not remove the season. Stone walls could be cold. Large rooms required fuel. Stored food could spoil. Travelers could bring news of worse conditions elsewhere. Political power could draw demands into the household rather than keep them away, because retainers, guests, officials, soldiers, petitioners, and dependents all needed feeding. In a world of scarcity, a great house was not only safer, it was also more crowded with claims. The home, then, was the first institution most people knew. Before law reached them, before a bishop preached, before a king's order arrived, the household organized bread, fire, sleep, clothing, tools, animals, and obligation. The year 536 pressed against all of these things without needing to announce itself every morning. It was present when fuel burned too quickly, when damp entered bedding, when stored grain had to last longer, and when the next repair could not be postponed. A longer winter was not only a matter of temperature, it was a longer season of calculation. How much wood remained, how much grain could be spared, which animal could be fed, which garment could be patched again, which neighbor, patron, monastery, or church might help if the store failed. Under a darkened sky, survival became a domestic arithmetic written in food, fuel, cloth, timber, and time. Beyond the doorway, the fields still waited. Houses could hold warmth, food, and memory for a while, but they could not create the next harvest by themselves. The roof protected what had been gathered. The plow, the animals, the seed, and the weather decided what might come next. After the hearth and the storage bin, the story returns to the open ground, where work continued even when the season had become unreliable. Chapter 4: Fields, Animals, and the Work that Could Not Wait. Agricultural work did not pause because the sky had changed. The fields still required turning. The seed still had to be held back. Animals still needed fodder, and the household still counted the year by tasks that arrived whether anyone felt ready for them or not. In 536, this made rural life especially hard to escape, because the crisis did not replace ordinary labor with some new dramatic emergency. It entered the old labor and made each part of it less certain. In much of Europe, the field was not an open abstraction called farmland. It was a known piece of ground, worked by memory as much as by tool. A family knew which soil held water too long, which strip warmed earlier, which boundary marked a neighbor's claim, and where animals had to be kept from eating young growth. Some land belonged to great estates, some to smaller holders, some to churches or monasteries, and much of it was tied into obligations that reached beyond the household. A poor growing season did not erase those claims. Ploughing depended on strength that had to be fed. Oxen were valuable because they turned human intention into force, pulling wooden ploughs through soil that hands alone could not easily break. In some regions, the ard, a lighter plough, scratched and opened the earth rather than deeply turning it, while heavier soils required stronger teams and more demanding work. Iron fittings mattered where they were available, but the animal remained the central engine of cultivation. When hay was short, the next year's ploughing was already in danger. Seed grain was one of the cruelest forms of stored hope. It could be ground into meal when hunger pressed, but once eaten, it could not become the next harvest. This meant that a household in a failed or weakened season faced a calculation that was both practical and moral. To preserve seed was to endure present hunger for future possibility. To eat seed was to survive the present by narrowing the future. No chronicle needed to record each decision for the structure of the danger to be clear. Weather governed the timing of every choice. Sowing too early could lose seed to cold or wet ground. Sowing too late could shorten the growing season. Harvesting before grain dried properly could spoil storage, while waiting too long risked weather damage, birds, theft, or animals. In a year when the sun itself seemed weakened, these judgments became less trustworthy. The old signs still existed, but they had begun to answer in altered ways. Hay deserves its place beside grain because animals lived through winter on what summer allowed people to cut, dry, and store. A cold, wet, or weak growing season reduced meadow growth and made drying harder. Damp hay could rot. Poor fodder weakened animals. Weak animals pulled less, bred less reliably, gave less milk, and carried less value into the next year. A shortage in the hay meadow could pass quietly into the byre before it appeared in the field. Gregory of Tours, writing later in the 6th century, gives one of the richest windows into the anxieties of Gaul, where weather, famine, disease, royal conflict, and religious interpretation often appear close together. His world was not the exact first moment of 536, yet it preserved the language through which 6th century communities understood crisis. In Gregory's histories, bad seasons were never merely technical failures. They belonged to a moral and providential order in which human conduct, divine warning, and public suffering were woven together. That habit of explanation mattered in the countryside. A failed crop could be seen through the hand, the stomach, and the sermon at once. Farmers knew material causes: cold, rain, Poor soil, pests, lack of labor, damaged animals. Bishops and priests could add another frame, urging repentance, charity, fasting, or prayer. These explanations did not cancel one another for the people who lived with them. A field could fail because the weather was wrong, and the wrong weather could still be interpreted as a sign. Rural labor also depended on cooperation. Harvesting required timing and hands. Fences, ditches, paths, mills, barns, and grazing rights connected households whether they wished to be connected or not. Where land was organized under an estate, tenants owed labor or produce. Where villages shared access to meadow, woodland, or pasture, private hunger could disturb common arrangements. An animal straying into another person's crop was not a small matter when the crop was already thin. Manure linked animals and fields in another cycle of dependence. Livestock produced food, fiber, traction, and breeding stock, but they also returned fertility to the soil. Without enough animals, fields could weaken over time. Without enough fodder, animals weakened first. Woodland grazing, stubble feeding, and seasonal movement of livestock helped in some regions. Yet each strategy depended on access rights and local conditions. A household without rights to wood or pasture lived with a narrower margin. Tools were part of this same fragile order. A plough needed repair. A sickle could dull. A cartwheel could crack. Harness, rope, yoke, basket, rake, and storage bin all had to survive repeated use. Iron was valuable, woodworking skill mattered, and a broken tool during a short harvest window could cost more than the tool itself. The practical history of a crisis often lies in such objects, because the failure of one small thing could spoil the timing of many others. Women's labor ran through the agricultural year in ways that many formal records only partly reveal. Processing grain, tending gardens, managing dairy, preserving food, feeding animals near the house, spinning wool or flax, brewing, cooking, and helping at harvest could all belong to the work that kept a household alive. Children guarded animals, gathered fuel, scared birds from fields, or helped with small tasks as strength allowed. Older people carried memory, instruction, and work suited to bodies no longer able to perform the heaviest labor. A farm was not worked by an abstract peasant, but by a household of unequal bodies and repeated duties. In colder years, gardens and small plots mattered more than their size suggested. Beans, peas, onions, cabbages, herbs, leeks, and other local crops could thicken the diet when grain failed, though their exact presence varied by region and evidence. These foods rarely carried the prestige of wheat, but survival often rests on foods without prestige. A monastery garden, a household patch, or a protected strip near a dwelling could give variety, medicine, flavor, and a little resilience. The smallest cultivated places might be visited most often. Animals brought both comfort and burden into this world. Cows gave milk, sheep gave wool, pigs could turn woodland mast into meat, goats survived on rougher forage, chickens produced eggs where kept, and oxen gave power. Each animal also needed care, protection, and feed. Disease, theft, cold, and hunger threatened them as much as people, and the loss of breeding animals could outlast one bad winter. To count animals was to count future work. Royal and ecclesiastical power touched the field through demand. Rents in kind, taxes where old fiscal systems endured, labor services, gifts, hospitality obligations, and church dues drew part of the harvest away from the household. In ordinary years, these demands could be resented but survivable. Under a damaged harvest, they became sharper. A ruler, landholder, monastery, or bishop who insisted too heavily risked weakening the very people whose labor sustained the next season. Grain taken from a village left an absence in a specific bin. This did not mean that authority only extracted. Powerful institutions could also protect fields, organize storage, lend seed, distribute alms, maintain mills, defend rights, or settle disputes before they became ruinous. A monastery with stores might feed the poor. A bishop might intercede for a community. A landholder might preserve tenants because empty land produced nothing. In a crisis, dependence could wound, but it could also keep someone close to a source of grain, seed, or judgment. The hardest part of rural life in 536 may have been the demand to continue without knowing whether continuity would be rewarded. The field had to be sown even after a bad harvest. Animals had to be fed even when fodder was poor. Tools had to be repaired even when iron was scarce. Hay had to be cut even when the weather gave no confidence. Agriculture was a discipline of returning to the same tasks under new uncertainty. No single village can stand for all of Europe. The Mediterranean coast, the interior of Gaul, the mountains, the river valleys, Britain, Ireland, and the northern lands each carried different soils, crops, weather patterns, settlement forms, and political pressures. Yet the basic vulnerability was shared widely enough to bind them in one history. If the sun weakened and the growing season faltered, every society that depended on stored harvests had to answer through work. The answer began in the field. By the end of the first darkened year, the countryside had not stopped. That is part of what makes the crisis so revealing. Catastrophe did not always look like abandonment, flight, or visible ruin. Sometimes it looked like a thinner harvest, a smaller seed reserve, a weaker ox, a damp stack of hay, a repaired tool used 1 year longer than it should have been, and a family calculating whether the next season could still be trusted. From the fields, the pressure moved outward again, onto the roads that carried grain, orders, armies, letters, merchants, bishops, and rumors across a continent no longer held together in the old Roman way. Chapter 5. Roads through a fractured continent. Roads outlived the world that had built them. Across much of Western Europe, long after imperial offices had weakened or vanished, the stones, embankments, bridges, milestones, and straight approaches of Roman travel still marked the land. Some roads remained useful because they had been built with unusual care. Others survived as broken lines, patched routes, local tracks, and remembered ways between towns that no longer held the same importance they once had. In the year 536, when harvests became uncertain and the cold pressed on every store of food and fodder, those roads mattered because scarcity did not stay where it began. Italy showed this most clearly because it stood at the meeting point of old Roman habit, Ostrogothic rule, and Justinian's attempt to recover the western provinces. A road in Italy could carry a bishop's letter, a merchant's pack animal, a royal order, a soldier, a refugee, a cart of grain, or a rumor moving faster than any official could correct it. The old imperial map still lay beneath the feet of people who no longer lived under the old Western Empire. Stones set for one political world now served another. Movement had never been effortless, even in the best years. A cart needed wheels, axles, animals, harness, repair, and passable ground. A pack animal needed fodder and rest. A traveler needed food, shelter, permission, and some expectation that the next crossing or town would not be hostile. Weather could turn a road into mud, a ford into danger, or a mountain pass into a closed barrier. When a growing season weakened, the road did not merely become longer, it became hungrier. A cold year changed travel by changing what animals could eat. Oxen, mules, donkeys, and horses could move goods and people, but they required feed that came from the same strained countryside as human bread. Hay cut badly or stored damply reduced the strength available for hauling. Grain given to animals could not be ground for people. A merchant deciding whether to send goods across a region had to think not only about price and demand, but about whether the journey itself would consume too much of the margin. The road measured scarcity in hooves. Belisarius enters this landscape as more than a famous general. Under Justinian, he became one of the chief agents of imperial restoration, moving through the Mediterranean world in campaigns that required ships, roads, supplies, and negotiated obedience. His arrival in Italy in the Gothic War did not take place in an empty theatre of strategy. It took place among towns, farms, estates, bishops, ports, and granaries already bound to the practical difficulties of food and movement. War made roads urgent, and climate made their use more expensive. The movement of armies reveals a truth ordinary travel could hide. Soldiers did not live on courage. They required bread, fodder, clothing, shelter, weapons, carts, animals, and reliable lines of supply. A force passing through a district could buy, demand, requisition, or seize resources depending on authority and discipline. But every method placed pressure somewhere. In a poor year, the difference between provisioning an army and stripping a countryside could narrow quickly. Even an orderly march left mouths behind it. Roman roads were built for connection, but by the 6th century connection itself had become uneven. In some places, local rulers and officials still maintained routes because power needed movement. In others, bridges decayed, drainage failed, surfaces broke, and travelers shifted to easier paths nearby. A road could remain visible without remaining fully maintained. Grass might grow through joints in stone paving. A culvert might clog. A bridge timber might weaken while the route continued to be used because no better route existed. River travel often answered problems that roads could not solve. Rivers carried bulk more easily than carts over land, and boats could move grain, wine, oil, timber, salt, and people where channels permitted. The Rhine, Rhone, Danube, Seine, Loire, Po, and other river systems shaped the movement of goods and authority across regions. Yet rivers brought their own dependence on seasons, water levels, crossings, tolls, and local control. A river crossing was not just geography, it was a place where power could collect payment. Ports widened the world further. Mediterranean routes linked Italy, North Africa, Southern Gaul, Spain, Greece, and the Eastern Empire. Though war and piracy could make sea movement uncertain, Justinian's reconquest of Vandal North Africa had restored imperial access to one of the old grain-producing regions. But control over a region did not automatically make supply simple. Ships needed crews, cargo, favorable weather, harbor administration, and protection. When land harvests failed, the hope of imported grain became stronger, and so did the fear of ships delayed. Letters crossed this same world through official, ecclesiastical, and private channels. A bishop might write to another bishop. A ruler might send a command to a local official. A landholder might petition. A monastery might maintain ties with patrons, churches, or estates. The carrier of a letter was part of the message's reality, because writing only mattered if it could reach the person whose action it required. In a colder, poorer sequence of years, even information depended on bread and roads. Rumor moved more loosely. News of a strange sky, bad harvest, military movement, royal death, plague, saintly intervention, or miracle could travel without stable wording. In villages and towns, reports arrived from merchants, pilgrims, soldiers, clergy, servants, and displaced people. A rumor did not need to be false to be unstable. It could carry a real event through fear, hope, memory, and misunderstanding until it became larger than its source. The road carried that enlargement. A traveler in post-Roman Europe moved through overlapping authorities. A district might answer to a Gothic king, a Frankish ruler, a local magnate, a bishop, a city council, an imperial official, or a commander whose power rested on troops rather than older law. Boundaries were not always sharp in lived experience. What mattered on a journey was who controlled the bridge, who held the town, who could offer shelter, who demanded toll, and who had enough food to sell. Geography became political at every stopping place. Pilgrims and clergy belonged to this moving world as well. Shrines, relics, councils, episcopal visits, and monastic networks created routes of religious movement that crossed political divisions. A bishop traveling to negotiate, preach, seek support, or attend a gathering needed the same roads and provisions as a merchant. Religious authority could open doors that ordinary travelers found closed, but it still required animals, escorts, letters, and places to sleep. Holiness did not remove distance. For merchants, the road calculated risk. Salt, iron, cloth, wine, pottery, glass, livestock, tools, grain, and small luxury goods moved where profit justified danger. In hard years, some goods became less important while others became dearer. Salt, for preserving food, could matter greatly. Iron, for tools and fittings, retained value because repair sustained work. Grain became both necessity and power. A market was never just a place. It was the visible end of many journeys. Old milestones gave travelers a Roman measurement of space, even when Roman power had changed form or disappeared. Some remained standing with inscriptions to emperors whose authority no longer governed the road. Others were reused, moved, broken, or ignored. Their presence gave the countryside a strange layering. A person could pass the name of a dead emperor while carrying a message for a bishop under a Frankish king or a Gothic official. The road remembered more governments than the traveler served. Maintenance exposed the difference between inheritance and capacity. It was one thing to possess a road, another to keep it working. Drainage ditches had to be cleared, surfaces repaired, bridges rebuilt, and dangerous stretches watched. A strong state could command labor and resources for such work. A weaker local order might maintain only the sections most necessary to its own survival. In a climate crisis, the temptation to postpone repair grew because food, fuel, and immediate labor demanded attention. Neglected roads made future movement harder. The Gothic War, beginning in the later 530s, drew Italy into a prolonged struggle that made movement both necessary and destructive. Belisarius's campaigns depended on the ability to move men and supplies between ports, cities, and strategic routes. Rome, Ravenna, Naples, and other places mattered not only as names on a political map, but as nodes in a supply world. The cold years and the war years overlapped in ways that ordinary people could not separate neatly. A field damaged by weather and a field burdened by soldiers both fed the same anxiety. Cities felt these pressures with special clarity. A city needed food from beyond its walls. It depended on roads, rivers, carts, ships, storehouses, officials, merchants, and rural producers whose lives might already be strained. If supply faltered, urban life could become fragile quickly. The walls that protected a city did not grow grain. They gathered need into a smaller space. In Gaul and beyond, Frankish power moved through routes inherited from Rome and adapted to new political purposes. Kings and their followers traveled between estates, towns, churches, and military gatherings. Royal presence mattered because rule was still personal in many of its visible forms. A king consumed supplies wherever he went, but he also confirmed grants, received petitions, gave judgments, and displayed authority. The road brought power near enough to feed and fear. Travel also offered escape, though never a simple one. A household under pressure might move toward kin, patron, town, monastery, military service, or a region rumored to have better food. Such movement carried risk because leaving land, tools, animals, and local protection could deepen vulnerability. People who moved without strong claims elsewhere might become dependents, beggars, laborers, or servants. A road could lead toward help, but it could also strip a person of the few securities that remained at home. The crisis of 536 did not create the roads, the ports, the rivers, or the political fragmentation that shaped Europe. It tested them. Where routes still worked, they could carry relief, grain, letters, authority, and information. Where they failed, communities became more local, more dependent on nearby stores, and more exposed to the uneven mercy of their immediate rulers. Connection became a resource, and like every resource in a hard year, it was distributed unequally. Across the continent, the old Roman lines still crossed fields, hills, marshes, towns, and river valleys. Some were well used, some half kept, some remembered more than maintained. Under the altered sky, they carried the business of a fractured world, a bishop's request, a merchant's load, a commander's order, a hungry traveler's hope, a rumor about failed crops beyond the next ridge. The road did not end the crisis. It carried the crisis from place to place until it reached the people whose task was to govern, judge, bless, tax, and feed what remained. Chapter 6: Kings, Bishops, and Local Power. Power in 6th century Europe rarely arrived as a single, clean command from a distant capital. It came through a royal household moving from estate to estate, a bishop receiving petitioners near a cathedral church, a landholder deciding what could be taken from tenants, a scribe recording a grant, a warrior bound by oath, or an official trying to make an old system answer to a new ruler. In the year 536, when cold and uncertainty touched the harvest, authority mattered less as an idea than as a set of hands on food, land, judgment, and protection. Across the old Western provinces, political life had become layered. The Western imperial office was gone, but Roman habits did not disappear with it. Laws remained known in many places. Cities still possessed councils and old civic memories, Bishops occupied seats that had once belonged to late Roman urban importance, and kings ruled through a mixture of conquest, inheritance, alliance, and negotiated loyalty. A person living in Gaul or Italy could be shaped by Roman law, Christian teaching, royal demand, local custom, and the power of a nearby landholder. Crisis made those layers more visible. In Gaul, the Frankish world had grown out of military strength and political adaptation. Theuderic I, one of the sons of Clovis, ruled in the eastern Frankish sphere during the early 6th century, while Childebert hailed power from Paris and moved within the same wider Merovingian family order. Their kingdoms were not modern states with fixed borders and equal administration across all territory. Rule followed persons, households, loyalties, estates, churches, and the ability to gather men when needed. A king's authority became real when someone obeyed his summons, accepted his judgment, feared his punishment, or sought his favor. Italy had a different arrangement under the Ostrogoths. There, the Gothic kings had inherited a land filled with Roman institutions, Roman senators, Roman tax practices, and cities accustomed to administrative language. Ostrogothic rule did not simply erase Roman government, it rested upon much of it. Men such as Cassiodorus wrote in a Roman style for Gothic rulers, trying to keep offices, letters, exemptions, appointments, and commands moving through the old channels. A cold year entered this world as a problem of supply, but also as a problem of legitimacy. A ruler's strength in such conditions depended on the ability to appear useful. People might endure demands from power when power also brought order, protection, food, justice, or access to patrons. If a king only took, his authority became thinner. If a bishop only preached and never interceded, his words could lose weight among the hungry. If a landholder demanded rent from tenants whose fields had failed, he risked damaging the labor that would sustain his own estate. Scarcity turned rule into a test of proportion. Bishops stood at the center of many communities because they joined spiritual office to social authority. A bishop could preach repentance, supervise clergy, manage church property, distribute alms, negotiate with rulers, protect fugitives in certain circumstances, write letters, settle disputes, and speak for a city or district. His church might hold land and receive gifts from the wealthy. His household could include clergy, servants, scribes, dependents, and visitors. In a year of poor harvests, the bishop's role could pass from prayer into grain. This did not make bishops gentle figures outside politics. They could belong to aristocratic families, defend property, compete with rivals, and use their sacred office in worldly disputes. Yet that mixture made them important. They had literacy, buildings, networks, moral language, and a public place where people gathered. A royal hall might be far away, but the church was often nearer. The bishop's seat gave local society an address for fear. Gregory of Tours, writing later in the 6th century, shows this episcopal world from the inside. He was not merely an observer of kings. He was himself a bishop, a participant in the politics, disputes, miracles, feuds, and negotiations he described. Through him, the Merovingian world appears as a place where royal families, bishops, saints' cults, land, violence, disease, and famine all pressed against one another. His account is not neutral in the modern sense, but it is rich in the way lived power worked. Kings could command, but bishops could remember, interpret, and sometimes resist. A local dispute in this world might involve land boundaries, inheritance, theft, violence, marriage, church property, debt, or the obligations of dependents. When harvests were poor, such disputes became sharper because the thing being argued over had less surplus around it. A meadow, a mill, a store of grain, a vineyard, an orchard, or a right to pasture mattered more when the margin narrowed. Judgment was not a decorative function of authority. It decided who could keep using a resource. Oaths gave political life a personal weight. Men swore loyalty to kings, lords, patrons, or allies, and such promises were not treated as light speech. In a world where written administration was uneven, the spoken bond still carried power, especially when witnessed by others and framed by religious fear. An oath could bring protection, but it also created obligation. A man who entered another's service gained a place within a network, and the network could demand labor, fighting, travel, or loyalty in return. Dependence had a grammar. Land grants reveal another layer of power. A ruler might reward a follower, favor a church, confirm possession, or settle a dispute by granting land or rights over land. The document mattered because it turned authority into memory. Scribes, seals, witnesses, formulas, and preserved copies made a claim harder to erase. For a church or monastery, written confirmation could protect fields, vineyards, mills, woods, and tenants. In a hungry sequence of years, legal memory could protect food-producing property. Taxation had survived unevenly from the Roman world. In the Eastern Empire, fiscal systems remained stronger and more elaborate, while in Western regions, older forms had adapted, weakened, or been transformed by new rulers and local realities. Where tax or tribute still functioned, it drew the harvest into public power. Where it failed, rulers leaned more heavily on land, gifts, confiscation, hospitality, or personal following. In either case, the field stood beneath the crown. Hospitality was also political. A king, official, bishop, military party, or noble traveler required feeding and lodging, and the burden of receiving powerful guests could fall on communities or estates. In ordinary conditions, this could be an honor, a duty, or a strain. Under scarcity, it became heavier. A household that hosted power might gain protection or favor, but it also watched its stores diminish. A visit could bless the house and empty the bin. The Merovingian kingship of Theuderic and Childebert rested partly on movement. The king did not govern from one fixed bureaucratic center in the modern fashion. He traveled among estates, received men, distributed favor, confirmed loyalties, took counsel, and made his presence visible. This movement made rule personal, but it also made rule consumptive. Wherever the king and his following went, food had to be found. Royal authority ate as it traveled. In Italy, the Ostrogothic king's need to hold together Goths and Romans created a different balance. Gothic military identity and Roman administrative continuity had to coexist. Roman landowners, bishops, senators, and officials remained important because they possessed knowledge and property the regime needed. Cassiodorus's official writing belongs to this world of careful presentation, where the ruler appears as guardian of justice, protector of cities, and maintainer of order. In a bad year, such presentation had to meet the stubborn facts of supply. Conflict complicated everything. Justinian's Western ambitions would soon turn Italy into a long theater of war, and war altered the meaning of authority wherever it passed. A city might choose resist, surrender, negotiate, or endure siege. A landholder might shift loyalty. A bishop might intercede between armed power and frightened inhabitants. Soldiers needed food, and the people producing that food needed protection from the very forces claiming to protect order. The same road could carry law one month and requisition the next. For ordinary people, power could be experienced through small acts: a demand for grain, a judgment in a dispute, a summons to labor, permission to use woodland, a church distribution of alms, a landlord's decision to delay rent, a royal order read aloud, a bishop's intervention, a scribe's recorded claim. These moments did not always appear in chronicles, but they formed the local reality of politics. A kingdom was not only a name, it was the hand that reached into the harvest. Church property became especially important because it linked sacred obligation with material wealth. Gifts to churches and monasteries often came in the form of land, livestock, vessels, books, cloth, or rights of income. Such property could support clergy, charity, building, worship, and the poor, though it could also attract dispute. A wealthy church in a hungry district was a spiritual center and a storehouse of practical expectation. People came to it with prayers, but also with needs. Authority, then, did not stand outside the crisis of 536. It was one of the channels through which the crisis moved. Weak harvests raised questions of distribution. Cold sharpened disputes over fuel, pasture, and stored food. War increased the demand for supply. Bishops interpreted distress and managed help. Kings measured loyalty through service and tribute. Landholders calculated how much pressure their dependents could bear before the estate itself weakened. No single ruler controlled the whole experience of Europe under the dimmed sky. Justinian ruled from Constantinople with imperial ambition. Ostrogothic kings tried to preserve Italy through a mixed Roman and Gothic order. Frankish rulers expanded and divided power through family and war. Bishops governed souls while managing property and local negotiation. Beneath them all, households weighed grain, repaired tools, watched animals, and looked toward those who might judge, tax, protect, or feed them. As the cold years continued, people did not live only under weather. They lived under obligations. Some obligations protected, others extracted. Many did both. A bishop's church, a royal estate, a landlord's hall, a monastery store, and a written grant could stand between a household and ruin, or they could press more heavily on a household already near the edge. From these structures of power, the year moved into the language people used to explain it, and that language was spoken most regularly in churches: processions, fasts, sermons, relic shrines, and prayer. Chapter 7: Prayer when the seasons failed. Prayer in 6th century Europe was not separated from weather, hunger, illness, or public order. A failed season could be read in the field, but it could also be carried into the church, where bishops and priests gave distress a language that communities already understood. In the year 536, when the sun seemed weakened and the growing world became less reliable, people did not meet the crisis only with stores, tools, roads, and rulers. They met it with fasting, processions, almsgiving, relics, sermons, and the repeated belief that the visible world answered to an invisible judgment. The church stood at the center of many towns and districts because it gathered people who otherwise lived scattered across estates, lanes, villages, and fields. Its calendar divided the year into fasts, feasts, vigils, saints' days, and seasons of penitence. Those divisions gave time a sacred pattern even when the weather lost some of its ordinary pattern. A cold summer or a thin harvest could disturb agricultural expectation, but the feast day still arrived. The Mass was still said, and the bishop's voice still offered an explanation larger than the farm. Caesarius of Arles gives this world a particularly clear shape. He lived from the late 5th century into the 6th, became Bishop of Arles, and preached to a population that included townspeople, rural laborers, landowners, clergy, and the poor. His sermons were practical as much as theological. He warned against drunkenness, greed, superstition, sexual misconduct, neglect of the poor, and careless attendance at worship, because he believed Christian life had to be ordered through repeated instruction. In a frightened community, that kind of preaching could turn anxiety into obligation. Arles itself mattered because it stood in southern Gaul, close to older Roman urban traditions, Mediterranean roots, and the contested politics of post-Roman rule. A bishop there did not speak only to private souls. He spoke into a public world where land, food, status, patronage, and religious authority overlapped. Caesarius's preaching assumed that people needed correction, but it also assumed they could respond together. A sermon was an act of discipline, heard by a gathered body. When seasons failed, fasting gained sharper meaning. Fasting was already part of Christian practice, tied to penitence, preparation, humility, and communal order. Under scarcity, it could become difficult to distinguish spiritual discipline from material want. Yet the difference mattered inside the religious imagination. A voluntary fast could express repentance. An involuntary hunger could be interpreted as trial, warning, or punishment. Bishops had to speak across that boundary carefully, because the hungry did not need abstract severity as much as guidance, charity, and hope. Processions brought prayer into the open. Communities could move through streets, around fields, toward churches, or to the shrines of saints, carrying litanies and supplications into the spaces where fear had settled. Rogation practices, associated especially with prayers for protection, crops, and mercy, belong to a world in which public movement and religious speech were joined. The procession did not change the weather by any mechanism modern science would recognize, but it changed the community's posture before the weather. People who were scattered by labor became visible to one another. Relics also carried a form of nearness. The bones, garments, oil, dust, or objects associated with saints were not treated as reminders alone. They were points of contact with holy power, kept in churches, carried in ritual contexts, placed under altars, and surrounded by stories of healing, protection, and intervention. In a time when the sky itself seemed strange, relics gave local communities a sacred presence that could be approached. A saint's shrine offered a place to bring fear without needing to understand the atmosphere. The cult of saints shaped how communities remembered danger. If a harvest recovered after prayer at a shrine, if a town survived disease, if rain came after procession, or if a feared disaster lessened, the event could be attached to the saint's care. Modern readers may separate coincidence, climate, and devotion more sharply than 6th century communities did. The historical point is not whether every claim can be verified as a miracle. It is that communities recorded rescue in the language available to them. Almsgiving joined belief to food. The wealthy were urged to give because charity was not optional decoration in Christian teaching. Bishops could shame the rich, praise generosity, organize distribution, and remind landholders that stored abundance carried spiritual danger if the poor were left unaided. In hard seasons, these teachings became more than moral instruction. They helped decide whether grain, coin, clothing, or shelter moved from one social level to another. Mercy could be measured in actual bread. A bishop's authority in famine or failed harvest rested partly on this ability to bind material action to spiritual meaning. If he told the wealthy to give, he was not only offering advice, he was invoking judgment, salvation, public reputation, and the example of saints. If he told the poor to endure, he also had to defend them against cruelty when he could. The church could not feed everyone in every crisis, but it could turn neglect into sin and charity into obligation. That mattered in a world where law and kindness did not always reach the weak at the same hour. Sermons against superstition reveal another side of fear. Caesarius and other church leaders often worried that Christians turned to charms, diviners, magical practices, seasonal rites, or older habits when danger came. Bad weather, illness, infertility, and crop failure all encouraged people to seek help wherever it seemed available. A bishop opposed such practices because they threatened Christian discipline, but their persistence also shows how urgently people wanted protection. Fear rarely obeys one institution at a time. For rural communities, the boundary between church teaching and older seasonal habits could be difficult to police. Fields had always carried rituals of blessing, protection, memory, and local custom. Christianity did not remove the need to ask for growth, rain, safety, and fertility. It redirected those needs through saints, prayers, crosses, relics, and the authority of clergy. In a damaged year, the field became a place where theology and agriculture met. A blessing over crops was a religious act placed upon a material risk. The church calendar helped people endure time by giving repetition to uncertainty. Even when harvest timing shifted, Lent, Easter, Pentecost, saints' feasts, Advent, and local commemorations returned with recognizable order. Bells, chants, psalms, readings, candles, vestments, and processions shaped days that might otherwise feel formless under fear. The body learned these rhythms through standing, kneeling, fasting, walking, listening, and receiving. Repetition made crisis less solitary. Monasteries strengthened this pattern in a more regulated form. Monks prayed the hours, worked, read, ate, slept, and kept discipline under a rule that made time itself obedient. When the outside world seemed unstable, the monastery offered an image of ordered life, though it still depended on crops, fuel, labor, and patrons. Its prayers did not float above material need. They were said by bodies that needed bread, warmth, clothing, and sleep like everyone else. Public repentance could also carry social pressure. A community called to fast or process did not respond only as isolated believers. People saw who attended, who gave alms, who neglected worship, who seemed arrogant, who remained outside discipline, and who displayed humility. Religious response created a public map of moral reputation. In a small community, reputation could matter almost as much as property. A person known as ungenerous in a hungry year carried a visible stain. The strange sky of 536 would have sharpened this religious attention because it touched something universal. Not everyone saw the same ruler. Not everyone used the same market. Not everyone lived under the same law. But everyone depended on light, warmth, growth, and the yearly return of food. When the sun itself seemed altered, explanation had to reach higher than ordinary misfortune. The heavens were not scenery to the 6th century mind. They were part of the order through which God's world became readable. Yet religion did not make the crisis gentle. Prayer could gather people, but it did not guarantee full granaries. Fasting could discipline the body, but it could not replace a lost harvest. Relics could console, but winter still required fuel. The strength of religious practice lay partly in its ability to hold material suffering inside a meaningful pattern, not to remove all suffering from the world. A procession could end at the church door with the fields still cold beyond the town. This is why the religious life of 536 should not be treated as a decorative layer above real history. It was one of the ways real history was organized. Bishops interpreted the year. Churches gathered the fearful. Almsgiving moved food. Sermons disciplined behavior. Relics gave local form to hope. Processions turned private anxiety into public petition. In a world where the sky, fields, and body all seemed exposed, prayer made exposure communal. From the churches and processions, the year entered another kind of keeping. Some fears were spoken aloud and then lost. Others were written down, copied, preserved, and carried across centuries by monks, bishops, chroniclers, and scholars who treated strange weather as part of sacred and historical memory. After the prayers had been said and the processions had returned, ink and parchment began their slower work, holding the dim year in records that would outlast the people who first looked up at the altered sun. Chapter 8: Monasteries, Manuscripts, and Memory. A strange year survives only if someone keeps it. Weather passes, crops fail or recover, rulers die, roads change hands, and hunger leaves fewer traces than stone or law. The year 536 endured because its disturbance entered several kinds of record: chronicles, letters, later histories, tree rings, ice, and the habits of institutions that believed writing could carry truth across time. Without those keepers, the darkened sun would have belonged only to the frightened generation that saw it. In the 6th century, writing was not common in the way modern life knows it. Most people did not leave diaries, household notes, or private accounts of the cold year. Their work remains visible through tools, bones, fields, graves, buildings, and the words of others. The people who wrote most often belonged to courts, churches, monasteries, administrative offices, and educated households. This means the record of 536 is uneven from the start. It remembers the world through the hands that had ink. Cassiodorus stands near the center of that written survival. Born into a Roman aristocratic family, he served the Ostrogothic kings of Italy as a statesman, administrator, and literary man, writing in a polished Latin style that tried to preserve Roman order inside a changed political world. His official letters show a government still speaking in the language of justice, supply, repair, taxation, appointment, and public care. Later, after public life, he founded the monastery of Vivarium in southern Italy. There, learning became a form of preservation. Vivarium was not famous because it ruled territory or commanded armies. Its importance lay in the way Cassiodorus imagined Christian scholarship. Monks were to copy, read, correct, preserve, and study texts. Sacred scripture stood at the center, but grammar, history, medicine, and older learning were not dismissed as useless. Cassiodorus understood books as fragile bodies. They could decay, be miscopied, be neglected, be lost in war, or survive because disciplined hands continued the work. A manuscript began with material before it became memory. Parchment came from prepared animal skin, scraped, stretched, dried, cut, and ruled for writing. Ink required recipes and ingredients that varied by region and practice. Pens had to be cut, pages had to be arranged, folded, gathered, and bound. A book cost labor before it carried meaning. In a hungry or unsettled century, the decision to spend labor on copying was never weightless. Monastic copying was slow enough to change the meaning of attention. A scribe did not preserve a chronicle by admiration alone. He preserved it line by line, letter by letter, through a physical process that could be interrupted by cold fingers, poor light, weak materials, illness, obedience to the hours of prayer, and the daily work required to keep the monastery alive. Every copied page joined the intellectual world to the agricultural one. The hand that wrote still needed bread. Records of weather often survived because communities believed unusual signs mattered. A darkened sun, failed harvest, comet, eclipse, famine, plague, flood, hard winter, or strange season could be entered into a chronicle as part of the moral and providential history of the world. Such notices were often brief. Their brevity can mislead. A line about a failed harvest may stand in for months of anxiety, labor, and hunger that the writer did not describe because his purpose was not domestic storytelling. Irish annal traditions preserve this kind of memory with striking economy. Later manuscript witnesses record notices around the mid-6th century that refer to failures of bread or scarcity. Though the exact transmission of these entries requires caution, the annal form is spare by nature. It places a year beside an event, leaving little explanation, no private voice, and almost no scene, yet its spareness gives it force. Something happened that later keepers thought belonged beside the year. Chronicles were not written as modern climate archives, but they became climate archives by accident. Writers recorded signs because signs had meaning. They preserved failed seasons because failed seasons mattered to Christian history. Royal fortune, communal punishment, or divine warning. Modern scholars can place these notices beside tree rings and ice core evidence, but the original writers were not assembling a proxy dataset. They were making sense of God's time. Tree rings offer a different witness. A tree does not explain a cold summer, but it records growth under the conditions given to it. Narrow rings in the middle of the 6th century show stress in wood, especially when compared across regions and species. This kind of evidence has no sermon in it, no royal politics, no theology, no fear of sin. It is not more human than the Chronicles, but it is steadier in a different way. The trunk kept what the page described. Ice keeps another part of the story. Volcanic sulfate and microscopic traces preserved in ice cores allow modern researchers to detect eruptions that ancient witnesses could not locate or understand. The atmosphere that dimmed the sun left material signs far from the people who saw the altered light. When read together, ice, wood, and writing turn 536 from a strange literary notice into a wider environmental event. Each witness is incomplete alone. Monasteries helped bridge the space between fragile experience and durable record. Their routines were not designed only for preservation, but preservation grew naturally from them. Prayer divided the day. Labor supported the house. Reading instructed the soul. Copying protected sacred and useful texts. Hospitality brought news. Letters connected abbots, bishops, patrons, and other communities. A monastery was a listening place as well as a writing place. The survival of memory also depended on selection. Many events were never written. Many written things were lost. Some texts survived only in later copies made far from their origin. A chronicle entry might pass through several hands before reaching the manuscript known today. Each copying preserved an altered risk at the same time, because mistakes, omissions, corrections, and local assumptions could enter the page. The past did not travel to the present untouched. This unevenness matters for the phrase Dark Age. The term can suggest that people lived in ignorance, but the deeper issue is often that evidence has thinned. Some areas are dark to modern historians because fewer written sources survive, not because the people there had no order, skill, memory, or thought. Archaeology, place names, law codes, saints' lives, annals, inscriptions, and environmental evidence help widen the light. The darkness is partly in the archive. A bishop's letter, a monk's chronicle, a royal law, or an annal entry also reflects institutional interest. Churches remembered saints, miracles, disputes, famine, repentance, and divine signs. Courts remembered grants, privileges, offices, boundaries, and obligations. Monasteries remembered benefactors, books, rules, abbots, and events that touched their place in sacred history. The poor appear when institutions noticed them, helped them, judged them, taxed them, feared disorder from them, or praised charity toward them. Their own voices are mostly hidden behind someone else's script. Still, hidden does not mean absent. The records that survive point constantly toward the unwritten majority. A famine notice implies households without enough grain. A sermon on almsgiving implies poor people at the edge of need and wealthy people with stores. A land grant implies workers, boundaries, tools, animals, and produce. A rule about monastic clothing implies cold bodies and worn garments. The archive speaks most clearly about institutions, but its shadows are filled with ordinary labor. Cassiodorus's later life at Vivarium is especially fitting for this century because it joins decline and continuity without making either one simple. He had served a Gothic kingdom that tried to maintain Roman order in Italy. He then turned toward a monastic project that treated books as vessels of survival. In his world, public office, Christian learning, Roman literature, and disciplined copying belonged to the same broad concern: how something valuable could endure after political forms changed. The shelf became a quieter kind of statecraft. The year 536 reached such shelves because it disturbed expectations strongly enough to be written. A normal summer rarely needed a chronicle notice. An ordinary harvest left fewer words than a failed one. A steady sun was not an event. The dimmed sun became an event because it made the dependable sky visible as something that could fail. The page kept that failure in a small space. Memory, in this sense, did not sleep inside one place. It traveled through Constantinople, Syria, Italy, Gaul, Ireland, and later Scriptoria, where earlier words were copied again. It lived in Christian chronology, in local annals, in administrative habits, and, without human intention, in trees and ice. A 6th century monk copying a text could not know that future scholars would place a chronicle line beside volcanic chemistry and dendrochronology. His work still made that comparison possible. After the prayers, the roads, the fields, and the stored grain, the record becomes another form of shelter. It did not protect the people of 536 from hunger or cold, but it protected the fact that they had lived through them. In a century of broken routines and uncertain seasons, a copied line could carry the shape of a darkened year farther than any traveler, cart, or royal messenger. Once preserved, the year could enter another domain of daily life: markets, prices, debts, rents, and the fragile exchanges that turned scarcity into a social fact. Chapter 9. Markets, when grain became uncertain. A market in the 6th century was never only a place where goods changed hands. It was a meeting point of harvest, distance, authority, trust, and need. Under an ordinary sky, a sack of grain, a measure of salt, a length of cloth, or an iron tool already carried many histories inside it. In the years after 536, when the growing season had been disturbed and food margins had narrowed, those histories became harder. The price of a thing could begin in the weather before it reached the hand of the buyer. Grain stood at the center because nearly every other exchange could be measured against it. A coin had value only if someone trusted that it could be turned into food, service, protection, or obligation. A rent paid in kind mattered because it moved actual produce from one household to another. A debt called in after a weak harvest could break a family more quickly than the same demand in a year of plenty. Scarcity did not change the need for exchange. It changed the pressure under which exchange took place. In parts of the old Roman world, coinage still circulated, especially where cities, military payments, taxes, and long-distance trade remained stronger. Gold solidi, smaller denominations, local issues, older coins, clipped pieces, and payments reckoned in older units could all appear within the wider monetary habits of the age. Yet coin did not rule every corner equally. In many rural settings, produce, labor, animals, tools, protection, and favors could matter as much as metal. The economy did not end where coin thinned. It changed its language. A tenant who owed grain to a landholder did not owe an abstraction. The obligation had weight, volume, timing, and a place of delivery. Grain might be measured in baskets, sacks, local measures, or administrative units whose exact size varied across regions and systems. It had to be gathered, threshed, dried, carried, and stored before it became payment. If the harvest was poor, the obligation did not become lighter merely because the field had failed. Someone had to decide whether mercy, delay, enforcement, or seizure would follow. Administrative records from the late Roman and post-Roman worlds show how deeply food, tax, and authority were joined. The Eastern Empire maintained a more elaborate fiscal system than much of the former West, but even in Italy under Ostrogothic rule, Roman habits of command and record still shaped government. Officials thought about supply through letters, exemptions, privileges, transport, and orders. The language could be polished, but the matter beneath it was blunt. Cities, armies, officials, churches, and courts had to be fed. A grain obligation moving through this world began with soil and ended in power. Cultivators worked the land and produced the crop. Landholders claimed rents or shares. Officials might demand tax. Storehouses received what was owed. Carts, animals, boats, or human backs carried the produce toward another place. At each stage, someone could lose, delay, spoil, conceal, overstate, undercount, or demand more. Scarcity made each stage more tempting and more dangerous. Markets depended on trust, but trust grew thin when food did. A buyer wanted fair measure. A seller wanted enough return to justify parting with grain. A ruler wanted public order. A bishop wanted charity. A hungry crowd wanted bread before argument. Measures and weights mattered because fraud in a poor year was more than dishonesty. It was theft from survival. A short measure could be remembered longer than a harsh word. Salt belonged close to grain in practical importance. Without refrigeration, salt helped preserve meat, fish, cheese, and other foods where the local diet and supply allowed. Salt routes, coastal production, inland trade, and local rights could make it a valuable commodity far from the sea. In hard years, preservation mattered because food that could last into the next season carried special weight. A household with salt could defend time itself a little longer. Iron also held its value because tools stood between hunger and work. A plough fitting, knife, hinge, nail, axe, sickle, or horseshoe, where such objects were used, could decide whether labor continued efficiently. Repair was often cheaper than replacement, but even repair required skill and material. A blacksmith's work linked woodland, charcoal, ore, or scrap metal, transport, payment, and agricultural need. When grain was uncertain, the tool that helped produce grain became more valuable, not less. Cloth moved through another chain of necessity. Wool, linen, hides, and finished garments carried the work of animals, fields, spinning, weaving, dyeing, cutting, and sewing. A cloak could be sold, pledged, inherited, stolen, given, or repaired because it represented warmth and value at the same time. In a poor year, households might part with objects they would otherwise keep. The market could fill with the evidence of private narrowing. A belt, a pot, a tool, a garment, an animal that should have been kept for breeding. Debt sharpened all these movements. Borrowing seed, grain, coin, animals, or tools could carry a household through one season and bind it more tightly in the next. A patron might lend out of obligation or calculation. A monastery might support dependents while securing long-term claims. A landholder might delay rent to preserve labor or insist on payment to protect his own stores. Debt could be kindness recorded in hard terms. It could also be the slow transfer of land, labor, and freedom from the weak to the strong. Market days gathered more than goods. They gathered news, rumor, judgment, and comparison. A person coming from another district might report whether crops were better beyond the hills, whether a bishop had opened stores, whether soldiers had passed, whether a road was safe, whether grain was cheaper near a river town. In uncertain years, information became part of value. A rumor about supply could raise prices before the cart arrived. Cities were more vulnerable to market failure because they ate beyond their walls. Even a small town required food from its surrounding countryside, and larger cities depended on organized movement. Bakers, millers, carriers, warehouse keepers, officials, guards, merchants, and laborers formed the visible machinery of urban food. If the chain weakened, the city learned quickly that stone walls, churches, workshops, and markets could not feed themselves. Urban hunger was a countryside problem made crowded. Rural households, however, were not safe merely because they lived near fields. A tenant might produce grain and still have too little after rent, tax, seed reserve, animal feed, and household consumption were counted. A bad harvest could leave the cultivator surrounded by land yet unable to eat from it freely. This is one of the hardest facts of agrarian life. Proximity to food did not always mean command over food. Churches and monasteries stood within the market world even when they spoke a language higher than trade. They received land, produce, animals, coin, vessels, books, and cloth. They gave alms, maintained buildings, supported clergy, copied texts, hosted travelers, and sometimes stored considerable resources. In scarcity, their property made them responsible in the eyes of the poor and tempting in the eyes of rulers. A church granary was never only a religious possession when people nearby lacked bread. Royal power could intervene in price and supply, though unevenly. A king or official might order grain moved, restrain abuses, grant exemptions, protect cities, punish hoarding, or demand provision for an army. The effectiveness of such orders depended on distance, obedience, available stores, and local cooperation. Written authority traveled faster than carts only in appearance. The grain still moved at the speed of animals, roads, rivers, weather, and human consent. In Italy, the overlap of Gothic rule and Roman administrative practice gave food politics a formal shape. Official letters could present the ruler as guardian of fairness, protector of cities, and corrector of local abuse. Whether every command worked as intended is another matter. Still, the survival of such administrative language shows that supply was understood as a public responsibility. A hungry city was not treated as a private misfortune. Exchange also had a moral vocabulary. Christian preaching warned against greed, hoarding, false measure, neglect of the poor, and wealth without mercy. These warnings mattered because market behavior was judged not only by profit, but by salvation, reputation, and communal peace. A merchant who raised prices during scarcity might be acting within the logic of risk, but he could also be condemned within the logic of charity. The same sack of grain could be priced in coin and in sin. Barter often appears simple from a distance, but it required its own forms of trust. If grain was exchanged for labor, cloth for food, an animal for debt relief, or tools for protection, both sides needed some shared understanding of equivalence. Scarcity disturbed equivalence because necessities rose faster than objects of comfort. A household might sell something valuable and still receive too little food in return. Desperation is a poor negotiator. Storage shaped market behavior as strongly as production did. Someone with full bins could wait, someone with an empty household could not. Waiting itself became a privilege. A landholder, monastery, merchant, or official storehouse could choose when to sell, lend, distribute, or conceal. Poor households lived closer to immediate exchange because they had fewer ways to delay need. Time belonged more generously to those with stores. The weather of 536 entered these relationships slowly and then all at once. First came the weak season, then the smaller yield, then the reduced store, then the sharper price, then the harder debt, then the desperate sale, then the deeper dependence. Not every place followed the same sequence. Some regions had better reserves, stronger trade links, kinder patrons, more effective bishops, or less damaged harvests. Yet the structure of vulnerability was widely recognizable. When grain became uncertain, everything that leaned on grain trembled. Markets did not end in the dim years. People still bought, sold, owed, carried, measured, repaired, lent, pledged, and gave. That continuity is important because crisis often reveals a society by showing what continues under strain. The stall still opened if there was something to sell. The measure was still filled if there was grain to pour. The debt was still remembered if the creditor chose to remember it. The poor still came to the places where food might be found. Behind every exchange stood the same question: who could command the next meal? A coin might answer it, a patron might answer it, a monastery might answer it, a field, a tool, a stored sack, a bishop's order, a merchant's cart, or a royal command might answer it for a while. In the years after the sun weakened, value gathered around whatever could keep hunger away until the next uncertain harvest. From those markets and stores, the history moves toward another pressure waiting in the same century. The vulnerability of bodies before illness had fully announced itself. Chapter 10. Illness before the Great Plague. Illness had not waited for the famous plague to begin. Long before the great outbreak of 5041 entered the eastern Mediterranean world, people in 6th century Europe already lived close to weakness, exposure, hunger, poor sanitation, seasonal disease, and the ordinary dangers of bodies under strain. The year 5036 did not create sickness in a world that had been healthy before it. It narrowed the margin through which many people had been enduring. Food stood at the beginning of that narrowing. A household with less grain did not only lose comfort, it lost resistance. Thin meals, poor bread, reduced dairy, fewer stored legumes, and the sale or slaughter of animals could change the body slowly without producing a single dramatic moment. Children, elders, pregnant women, servants, laborers, and the chronically unwell stood nearest to the edge. Hunger did not need to be absolute before it made fever, infection, cold, and exhaustion more dangerous. A cold sequence of years also pressed people into closer arrangements. Families shared warmth around hearths. Animals were kept near human spaces when protection or shelter required it. Travelers sought lodging where they could find it. The poor gathered around churches, estates, markets, ports, and towns when food became scarce. Crowding did not always mean a large city. It could mean too many bodies near one fire, too many dependents at one gate, or too many strangers waiting near a place where bread might be distributed. Water carried its own risks. Wells, streams, cisterns, rivers, and stored water depended on local practice, maintenance, and weather. Flood, drought, mud, animal waste, and poor drainage could turn ordinary sources into sources of illness. In rural settlements, the closeness of people, animals, refuse, and water shaped everyday health. In towns, drainage, waste removal, street conditions, and crowding added further difficulty. The 6th century body lived inside an environment that modern people would find relentlessly exposed. The coming Justinianic plague belongs to this chapter only as a horizon. It began spreading through the eastern Mediterranean in the early 540s, with Pelusium in Egypt often named in the tradition as an early point in its recorded movement. From there, the disease reached Alexandria, Constantinople, and other parts of the empire through the same networks that carried grain, soldiers, merchants, officials, letters, and taxes. The plague did not travel through emptiness, it traveled through connection. Justinian's empire depended on connection at an immense scale. Constantinople required food, especially grain, from distant producing regions. Ships crossed the Mediterranean with cargoes that tied Egypt, North Africa, Syria, Asia Minor, Greece, Italy, and the capital into one practical world. Ports gathered goods, animals, sailors, dock workers, officials, soldiers, merchants, beggars, and local inhabitants into crowded edges of land and water. When disease found such routes, empire became a path. Pelusium's significance lies in geography as much as narrative. Sitting near the eastern edge of the Nile Delta, it belonged to a region whose grain, river systems, and Mediterranean access made it part of the empire's food machinery. A port was never just a harbor. It was a storehouse, checkpoint, workplace, tax point, lodging zone, animal space, and news exchange. Cargo did not move alone. It moved with people, pests, ropes, sacks, baskets, ship's timbers, and the small accidents of daily handling. Modern accounts of the Justinianic plague often discuss rats, fleas, and the bacterium Yersinia pestis, but a sleep chronicle does not need to dwell on the body's suffering to understand the historical danger. What mattered for the societies of the 540s was that disease could use the same structures that made imperial life possible. Grain fleets, roads, military routes, urban markets, and ports were achievements of organization. They were also corridors of exposure. Before the plague's full arrival, the cold years had already weakened some of the structures that might have absorbed a blow. Poor harvests reduced food security. War in Italy strained towns and countryside. Taxation and supply demands moved resources away from local households. Travel and displacement created new contacts between communities. Religious institutions faced greater demands for charity. A society under pressure does not break in every place at once, but it carries less reserve. Constantinople itself represented both strength and vulnerability. It was a capital of law, ceremony, walls, churches, administration, trade, and imperial ambition. Its size required constant provisioning. Grain came in through organized channels. Water moved through major infrastructure. People from many regions entered its markets, churches, docks, palaces, barracks, and neighborhoods. Large cities could gather wealth, skill, and power. They also gathered breath, waste, hunger, and rumor. When Procopius later described plague in Constantinople, he wrote as a witness shaped by the same intellectual world that had preserved the dimmed sun. His accounts belong to an elite literary tradition, and their numbers and interpretations must be handled with care, yet they preserve the sense of a city overwhelmed by something beyond ordinary administration. The empire that could build Hagia Sophia and send armies across the sea could not command disease to obey. Power had limits that the body revealed. In Western Europe, the relationship to plague was more uneven and less fully documented in many regions. Some areas were touched directly, others indirectly, and the surviving evidence varies greatly. What can be said with more confidence is that the conditions of vulnerability were widespread. Poor nutrition in hard years, local crowding, movement along trade and military routes, weak sanitation by modern standards, dependence on animals, and uneven access to care. Illness entered these conditions without needing a single map of equal impact. Care for the sick usually belonged first to households. Family members, servants, neighbors, monks, nuns, clergy, and local healers formed the immediate circle of response. Remedies could include herbs, diet, rest, prayer, bleeding in some medical traditions, amulets condemned by church authorities, relics, blessings, and inherited practical knowledge. Learned medicine still existed, especially in texts and urban centers connected to the Roman and Greek medical inheritance, but most people met sickness through local means. The sickbed was often a domestic place before it was an institutional one. Monasteries and churches gave care a moral and social frame. Hospitality to the poor and sick, burial of the dead, almsgiving, prayer, and the memory of Christ's mercy all shaped Christian expectations. A monastery might offer food, shelter, or treatment within its means, while a bishop might organize help or interpret disease through sermons and public prayer. These institutions did not possess modern medicine. They possessed buildings, land, stores, personnel, authority, and a language of obligation. Burial practice also reveals how communities handled mortality without requiring graphic description. Graves, cemeteries, churchyards, inscriptions where they survive, and changes in burial pattern can show stress, identity, status, and belief. In times of elevated death, the care of bodies became both practical and sacred. Christians treated burial as an act of mercy and hope, while families sought to place their dead within known religious and social landscapes. Even crisis had to be folded into ritual order. The fear of illness also changed movement. A traveler from a troubled port might be viewed differently. A report of disease along a route could alter trade, pilgrimage, military planning, or household decisions. Yet people could not simply stop moving. Grain still had to reach cities, armies still marched, bishops still wrote and traveled, merchants still sought profit, the poor still moved toward food. Disease lived in the tension between fear of contact and dependence on contact. It is easy to imagine the 6th century as helpless before disease, but that is only partly true. People had observations, habits, inherited medical ideas, rules of diet, practices of isolation in some circumstances, religious responses, and communal memory. They knew that sickness could spread, that bad air seemed dangerous, that certain seasons carried certain illnesses, that burial mattered, and that crowded places could become frightening. Their explanations were not modern explanations, but they were not empty. Human beings had always watched illness carefully. Still, observation did not give control. A body weakened by hunger could not be restored by explanation alone. A port could not feed an empire without also opening itself to movement. A city could not remain large without accepting dependence. An army could not fight without supply. A monastery could not show hospitality without receiving strangers. The same practices that sustained society also exposed it. The years after 536 therefore formed a darker preparation, though no one at the time could have known the shape of what was approaching. The cold had damaged harvests, scarcity had tightened dependence, war had increased movement and extraction, markets had shifted under pressure, churches had gathered fear into ritual, roads and ships had continued to join distant places because stopping them would have meant another kind of collapse. Then plague entered a connected world already carrying strain. This does not make climate the sole cause of the plague, nor does it turn the disease into a simple consequence of the dimmed sun. History seldom works with such clean lines. The cooling years, the wars of Justinian, the movement of grain, the density of cities, the ecology of rodents and fleas, and the vulnerability of human bodies all belong to a shared environment of risk. Each factor held part of the door open. For ordinary households, illness was one more uncertainty placed beside food, fuel, debt, weather, and authority. A sick worker meant less labor. A sick animal meant lost value. A sick child required care from someone already tired. A sick elder carried both grief and practical strain. Even before plague became the great event remembered by historians, sickness already shaped the small arithmetic of survival. A household counted strength as carefully as grain. The story then moves toward the plague without rushing into it. The year 536 had begun with altered light, but its consequences passed into the body through hunger, cold, crowding, travel, and fear. By the time the great disease arrived in the eastern Mediterranean, the world it entered was not untouched ground. It was a world of dim years, strained harvests, moving armies, crowded ports, and prayers spoken over bodies that had already learned how thin ordinary safety could become. North of the Mediterranean routes, the same cold years left different kinds of traces. In some places there were fewer written voices, fewer named witnesses, and more dependence on archaeology, settlement patterns, animal remains, pollen, and later memory. The crisis did not end at the edges of empire. It reached into northern landscapes where the growing season was already short and where a weakened sun could press hard against farms, halls, graves, and the fragile limits of survival. Chapter 11. The North in the Years of Cold. North of the Mediterranean. The year 536 becomes harder to hear in words and easier to sense through traces. The written record thins in many places, and the historian has to lean more carefully on archaeology, environmental evidence, settlement patterns, pollen, animal bones, graves, and later annalistic notices. A dimmed sun over the north did not need a chronicler in every valley to matter. In lands where the growing season was already short, even a small loss of warmth could press hard against the field. Britain, Ireland, Scandinavia, and the lands around the North Sea did not form one world. They differed in language, settlement, law, religion, trade, and political structure. Some regions carried older Roman traces, some had never belonged to Rome, and some were linked more by sea routes than by roads. Yet the northern lands shared a particular vulnerability. A shorter summer gave less time for grain to ripen, hay to dry, animals to fatten, and households to prepare for winter. When the sky weakened, the calendar narrowed. In Ireland, later annalistic tradition preserves notices of scarcity and failures of bread around the mid-6th century, though the transmission of these entries must be handled with caution. The value of such a notice lies partly in its spareness. A few words about bread failure do not describe the house, the field, or the face of the hungry person. They record that the failure mattered enough to be placed beside a year. The annal keeps the event as a mark, not a scene. Bread failure in the north was not identical to bread failure in a Mediterranean city. Diets varied by region, and some communities depended more heavily on oats, barley, rye, dairy, meat, fish, gathered foods, and local combinations that changed with landscape. Along coasts and rivers, fish could soften the blow of a poor grain year, though fishing itself depended on weather, boats, nets, labor, and preservation. Inland, livestock could offer milk, traction, manure, meat, and wealth, but animals needed hay and grazing. A cold summer could reach them through the meadow. Scandinavia presents one of the most debated northern pictures. Archaeologists have discussed settlement contraction, abandoned farms, changing elite sites, altered burial wealth, and signs of social stress in the 6th century. The evidence does not speak in one simple sentence, and not every change can be placed directly on the year 536. Still, climate stress fits the broader pattern of disruption. Tree rings and other proxies show severe cooling, while archaeological interpretation suggests that some northern communities passed through a period of pressure that reshaped settlement and power. A farm abandoned in the archaeological record is not the same as a written confession of disaster. It is an absence surrounded by material signs. Buildings fall out of use, field systems change, animal remains shift. Pollen evidence can suggest changes in cultivation, woodland, grazing, or abandonment. Grave goods may become richer in some places and poorer in others, not always because life improved or worsened in a simple way, but because society rearranged how wealth, status, and memory were displayed. Soil does not explain itself quickly. The Northern Hall gives another angle into this world. Elite halls in Scandinavia and neighboring regions were not merely large buildings. They were centers of feasting, gift-giving, loyalty, storage, display, ritual, and rule. A powerful household gathered followers by giving food, drink, weapons, rings, shelter, and honor. Under climate stress, such generosity became more difficult and more politically important. A lord who could still feed men in a hungry sequence of years gained a stronger claim on loyalty. That connection between food and rank appears across many early societies, but the northern world made it visible through the hall. Feasting turned surplus into relationship. Meat, ale, grain, dairy, and imported goods could all become signs that a leader had access to resources beyond the ordinary household. If harvests weakened and animals thinned, the ability to host became a test of power. The bench in the hall depended on the field outside it. Animal bones help fill the silence left by missing chronicles. They can show what species were kept, slaughtered, eaten, or valued, and at what ages animals were killed. A shift toward younger slaughter in hard conditions might suggest pressure on herds, though interpretation must remain local and cautious. Cattle, sheep, goats, pigs, horses, and poultry carried different meanings and uses across regions. The bones of animals are records of human decisions made under weather, hunger, wealth, and custom. Pollen also belongs to the archive of the North. Grains of pollen preserved in bogs, lake sediments, and soils can reveal changes in woodland, pasture, and cultivation. A decline in cereal pollen, or an increase in certain wild plants may point toward abandoned fields or altered land use. Such evidence is slow, cumulative, and regional, not a neat diary of one bad summer. It shows landscapes changing under pressure. Where written records are thin, the land keeps a rougher memory. Britain in the 6th century was itself fragmented and changing. The end of Roman administration had left roads, towns, villas, Christianity in some regions, local rulers, and shifting patterns of settlement and power. Written sources for the period are difficult, later partial, and often shaped by religious or political purpose. A climate crisis there would have entered a world already marked by local lordship, migration, conflict, and the rearrangement of old Roman spaces. The weather did not fall on stability. Coastal movement linked parts of the north in ways land routes could not. The North Sea, Irish Sea, Baltic, and Atlantic edges carried people, goods, stories, raiders, traders, monks, and migrants. Boats could connect places that roads did not easily join, but sea travel depended on season, skill, vessels, and risk. In a cold year, the coast could offer fish and movement, while also exposing communities to storm, scarcity, and strangers. Water connected and unsettled at once. Ireland's monastic and analytic culture would become especially important for memory. Monasteries there and in neighboring islands developed strong traditions of learning, copying, calculation, and recording. Some annal entries preserve environmental and food crises in condensed form. Those records do not give a full daily history of 53-6, but they show that northern Christian communities joined weather, scarcity, and time in writing. A year of bread failure could be made durable by a line of ink. The north also carried older and later traditions of cosmic disorder, harsh winters, and broken seasons, but caution is necessary. It is tempting to connect every later mythic memory of winter or darkness to the events of 53-6. Temptation is not evidence. Later Norse traditions passed through oral memory, poetic shaping, Christian manuscript culture, and centuries of transformation before they reached the forms now known. Climate catastrophe may have left deep cultural impressions, but the historian has to distinguish possibility from proof. What can be said more firmly is that cold matters differently where summer is brief. A Mediterranean farmer might suffer from cooling, but a northern farmer could lose a larger share of an already narrow ripening window. Haymaking could fail more easily. Barley might not mature properly. Animals might enter winter weaker. Stored fodder could run short before spring. The pressure was not only hunger in the present, it was the risk that the next year would begin with fewer animals, less seed, and less strength. Settlement contraction, where it occurred, did not always mean sudden flight. A household might move gradually toward better land, join another settlement, enter dependence, lose status, or abandon marginal ground that no longer rewarded the labor placed into it. Marginal land is often the first to speak during climate stress. It can be farmed in good sequences and released in hard ones. The edge of cultivation moves when the weather changes its terms. Graves show another kind of response. Burial practices in Northern Europe varied widely, including inhumation, cremation, grave goods, mounds, flat symmetries, and local customs shaped by status, belief, and community. The crisis does not always appear as poorer burials. Sometimes elites display more wealth in death during unstable times because power needs stronger symbols when life becomes less secure. A sword, brooch, bead, vessel, or animal offering may reveal not comfort, but the effort to preserve rank. The grave can answer fear with display. For ordinary households, the northern crisis remained practical before it became archaeological. The roof had to hold. The animals had to be kept alive. Fish had to be dried or smoked where possible. Grain had to be guarded. Children had to be fed through winter. Tools had to be repaired. Paths had to remain usable between farm, shore, hall, church, and field. Written testimony may be thin, but these needs do not require many documents to be historically real. Christianity's reach in the north was uneven in this period. Ireland had developed a vigorous Christian culture. Britain held Christian communities alongside other religious and political formations. Scandinavia remained largely outside Christian conversion until later centuries. Though contacts with Christian lands existed, this meant that the interpretation of a darkened sky varied across regions. Some communities framed crisis through Christian penitence and divine warning. Others may have understood it through older cosmologies, ritual obligations, or local traditions now only partly recoverable. Trade goods found in northern contexts show that distance had not vanished. Glass, metalwork, beads, coins, weapons, and imported objects could travel far through networks of exchange and gift. During climate stress, such networks might shrink, redirect, or become more important for elites trying to maintain prestige. An imported object in a grave or hall does not mean ordinary life was easy. It may show that power still reached outward even while rural households tightened inward. The northern world, therefore, refuses a simple picture of total collapse. Some places suffered, some adapted. Some elites may have strengthened their position, while weaker households lost land or independence. Some settlements declined, while others endured or changed form. Environmental stress worked through existing inequalities and local opportunities. A cold year did not make everyone equally poor. It made the distance between security and exposure more consequential. Archaeology teaches patience with such a period. A charred grain deposit, a pollen curve, a deserted farm, a rich grave, a repaired hall, a changed animal profile, or a brief annal notice each gives only part of the life beneath the cold sky. Put together, they suggest a north under pressure but not erased. The people who lived there did not know they were evidence. They were repairing, sowing, slaughtering, moving, praying, bargaining, and burying. As the 6th century continued, the northern traces joined the wider pattern of the dim years. The Mediterranean had chronicles, imperial histories, ports, and plague narratives. The north had shorter notices, material layers, settlement shifts, and environmental signs that required slower reading. Both belonged to the same altered century. The weakened sun crossed political, linguistic, and religious boundaries without asking how each society would record it. What remained in the north was not a single story, but a set of survivals. A line in an annal about bread, a farm no longer used, a hall repaired or rebuilt, a grave arranged with care, animal bones in a midden, pollen settled in wet ground, tree rings tightened by a season without enough warmth. These are modest witnesses, but they are not silent. They carry the cold years forward into the final question of the journey: what remained after the dimness, and how Europe continued when the sky slowly gave back its ordinary light. Chapter 12. The Cold Years after 536. The year 536 did not end cleanly when its calendar ended. For the people who lived through it, a year was not a sealed container. It was a harvest carried into winter, a seed reserve carried into spring, a herd carried through hunger, a debt carried into another season, and a memory carried into prayer and record. When the dimmed sun first entered the chronicles, it marked a beginning more than a boundary. The cold that followed belonged to a longer disturbance, one that modern scholars have traced through trees, ice, and the scattered testimony of frightened observers. A bad year could be survived if the next one restored the balance. That was the hope built into every agricultural society. A poor harvest might be answered by stored grain, help from kin, charity from a church, mercy from a landlord, or the sale of an animal that could not be spared twice. The danger deepened when recovery failed to arrive on time. One damaged season reduced the strength available for the next. A field sown with less seed, worked by weaker animals, and tended by a hungrier household began the year already diminished. Modern climate reconstructions suggest that the middle of the 6th century was not struck by one isolated atmospheric event alone. The cooling that began in 536 appears to have been followed by further volcanic disturbance around 540 and another around 547, contributing to a longer cold interval, often called the Late Antique Little Ice Age. Ancient witnesses could not have named this sequence in those terms. They experienced it as years in which weather, harvest, and sickness seemed to gather into a pattern too large for any one village to explain. Tree rings give this longer crisis a quiet precision. In many places, trees laid down narrow bands of growth, their wood recording poor conditions without fear, theology, or political judgment. The narrow ring is not a story by itself, but it marks a season in which the tree could not grow freely. When such rings appear across wide regions, they become a record of shared stress. The people of the 6th century left prayers, laws, letters, and chronicles. The forests left another archive beside them. Ice cores preserve a different testimony. Volcanic material trapped in ancient ice points toward eruptions whose ash and sulfate reached far into the atmosphere. Such eruptions could veil sunlight, cool summers, disturb rainfall, and shorten growing seasons far from the mountain that produced them. A person in Gaul, Ireland, Italy, or Scandinavia did not need to see a volcano to live beneath its consequences. The upper air could connect distant lands more silently than any road or empire. In ordinary life, the second and third difficult years could be harder than the first because reserves had already been touched. A household that had eaten part of its seed grain in one winter entered spring with less to sow. A family that had slaughtered breeding animals for food lost milk, manure, wool, traction, or future offspring. A landholder who pressed tenants too hard could find his own fields less productive later. A monastery that gave generously might find its stores thinner when another wave of need arrived. Survival left marks on the future. Cold also changed time by lengthening dependence. If crops ripened late, labor shifted. If hay dried poorly, animals entered winter weaker. If roads became harder to travel, markets received less. If prices rose, debt deepened. Each delay created another delay behind it. In such conditions, a year could feel less like a cycle that completed itself, and more like a weight carried from one season into the next. The poor carried that weight most directly. Their margin was smaller before the sky changed, and so the altered weather reached them sooner. They had fewer animals to sell, fewer stores to open, fewer patrons to call upon, fewer tools to pledge, and less authority in disputes over rent, grain, or pasture. Yet the poor also appear least clearly in the surviving record. They enter when someone preached about them, taxed them, fed them, buried them, feared unrest from them, or praised charity on their behalf. Their silence in the sources is not absence from the crisis. A bishop reading the signs of the times might speak of repentance, mercy, and divine warning. A ruler might think of order, tax, food supply, and military need. A farmer might think of seed, weather, animals, and tools. A monk might think of prayer, copying, fasting, and the rule of the house. Each frame was real inside its own world. The crisis of the cold years did not produce one meaning, it moved through several meanings at once. Cassiodorus's Italy shows how continuity and strain could exist together. His official letters belong to a world trying to maintain Roman administrative ideals under Gothic rule, and his later monastic project at Vivarium belongs to a world trying to preserve learning under changing conditions. Neither effort looks like simple collapse. They are acts of maintenance. Yet maintenance itself becomes more difficult when climate, war, and scarcity pull against the systems that make order believable. In Gaul, the Merovingian world was expanding through family power, conquest, division, and alliance. Kings did not rule a quiet landscape. They ruled through households, followers, bishops, estates, gifts, punishments, judgments, and movement. The cold sequence of years made such rule more demanding because generosity, warfare, taxation, and patronage all required resources. The king who gave gifts needed wealth to give. The bishop who fed the poor needed stores to distribute. The lord who held men by loyalty needed a hall that could still feed them. Northern regions carried the same pressure in another register. Where the growing season was already short, a run of cold summers could push marginal farms beyond their usefulness. Some settlements may have contracted or shifted. Though the evidence must be read carefully and region by region, the deserted farmstead does not speak with the clarity of a chronicle, but it speaks through absence, repair, abandonment, animal remains, and the changing use of land. The colder years entered the north through short summers and long consequences. Ireland's sparse annalistic notices of bread failure preserve the crisis in a form almost too brief for the suffering behind it. A few words could mark the failure of food, leaving the work of imagination to later readers. That sparseness is part of the historical truth. Many communities did not leave extended accounts of what hunger did to them. They left a year, a phrase, a remembered shortage. The page did not need to carry every bowl and bin to show that bread had failed. War made recovery harder in the Mediterranean and Italian worlds. Justinian's campaigns had already stretched imperial ambition across the sea, and the Gothic War in Italy would draw cities, fields, roads, and populations into long disruption. Climate stress did not create imperial ambition, but it made supply more delicate. An army needed grain in a world where grain had become less reliable. A city under military pressure needed food when the countryside around it might already be weakened. Strategy and weather met in the storehouse. The same was true of taxation. States and rulers did not stop needing revenue because harvests were poor. Soldiers had to be paid or supplied. Officials had to be maintained. Buildings, roads, walls, and courts required labor and material. In a strong year, extraction could seem like the normal cost of order. In a weak year, it became a question of how much could be taken before the productive base itself suffered. A tax demand looked different beside a thin field. Religious institutions were drawn deeper into social need. Churches and monasteries could be places of prayer, but also places of storage, charity, record, and negotiation. A hungry person might come for alms. A landholder might give property for the sake of the soul. A bishop might rebuke hoarding. A monk might copy a notice of famine into a chronicle. The sacred and the practical did not stand apart in these years. They shared walls, fields, vessels, and grain. The cold years also changed memory while they were still unfolding. A single strange summer might be remembered as an omen. Several difficult years could be remembered as an age of disorder. People explained such patterns through the frameworks available to them: divine judgment, sin, repentance, saintly protection, royal failure, bad rulers, troubled stars, strange signs, and inherited stories of punishment or mercy. Explanation was itself a form of survival because it gave fear a shape that could be spoken. Modern historians, working with climate data and written sources together, can see a larger pattern than any single 6th century observer could see. They can place Procopius beside tree rings, ice cores beside annals, volcanic signals beside famine notices, and plague narratives beside trade routes. Yet this wider vision should not flatten the lived experience. No one in a small settlement thought in hemispheric averages. They thought in bread, cold, animals, prayer, debt, and the next uncertain field. The phrase late antique little ice age gives the period a name, but names can make slow hardship sound too neat. What it describes was not a sheet of ice falling over Europe. It was a tendency toward cooler conditions, repeated shocks, altered harvests, pressure on fragile systems, and regional variation. Some places suffered more than others. Some recovered faster. Some elites adapted. Some households lost land, animals, or independence. A climate event becomes history only when it passes through unequal human worlds. By the later 530s and early 540s, the crisis had become layered. The first dimming of the sun remained in memory. Poor seasons had weakened food systems. Political demands continued. War pressed especially hard in Italy and the Mediterranean world. Religious communities gathered people into prayer and charity. Markets shifted value around scarcity. Roads and ships still moved goods and people because stopping movement would have brought its own danger. The old systems continued, but many continued with less ease. Then another force entered the century with devastating reach. Disease had always been present, but the plague that moved through the eastern Mediterranean from the early 540s gave the cold years a new companion. It did not replace the earlier crisis, it joined it. A society already strained by harvest trouble, war, taxation, movement, and fear now had to face the vulnerability of bodies in cities, ports, villages, monasteries, and camps. The cold years had narrowed the margin. The plague would show how narrow that margin had become. Chapter 13. Plague, war, and the narrowing margin disease entered the cold century through paths already worn by need. Ships still crossed the Mediterranean because cities had to be fed, armies had to be supplied, merchants had to earn, and officials had to move the business of empire from one coast to another. Roads still carried messengers, bishops, soldiers, refugees, and traders because a fractured world did not become still when it became frightened. After the dim years had weakened harvests and drawn down reserves, the plague that appeared in the early 540s did not arrive in a world with full strength waiting behind its doors. It came into systems already working close to their limits. Pelusium, near the eastern edge of the Nile Delta, appears in the tradition as one of the early points from which the great pestilence moved. Its importance was not accidental. Egypt had long belonged to the food machinery of the Eastern Roman world, and its waterways, granaries, ports, and officials tied local harvests to distant cities. Grain could leave the Nile country and feed people who had never seen the fields where it grew. The same network that made that feeding possible also created routes along which sickness, fear, and rumor could travel. Constantinople stood at the center of this connected world. It was a city of walls, churches, palaces, markets, docks, cisterns, law courts, workshops, and crowded neighborhoods, dependent on supplies from far beyond its own fields. Justinian ruled there with an ambition that had already reached across the sea into North Africa and Italy. His government still imagined empire as something that could be repaired through law, building, taxation, diplomacy, and war. The plague revealed another truth about empire. The more widely a system joined people, goods, and animals, the more widely danger could use the joining. Procopius, who had written of the dimmed sun, also became one of the major witnesses to plague in Constantinople. His account must be read as literary, moral, and political, as well as observational, because he wrote with the tools and expectations of an educated historian. Yet even with caution, his testimony preserves the sense of an imperial city overwhelmed by a force that administration could not master. Officials could count, command, bury, distribute, and report, but they could not make the sickness obedient. The old confidence of offices met the frailty of bodies. The plague did not erase the need for ordinary work. Bread still had to be baked, water still had to be drawn, the dead had to be buried according to the capacity of the living, doors had to be opened, animals fed, fires tended, children watched, and messages carried. A city in epidemic was not a silent city. It was a city in which every necessary act had become more frightening. The same hand that delivered food could bring contact. The same visitor who brought news could bring danger. In the countryside, illness moved through a different rhythm. Villages and estates were less dense than cities, but they were not sealed away from the wider world. Soldiers passed, merchants arrived, tenants owed produce, clergy traveled between settlements, relatives came seeking help, markets drew people together at intervals. A disease did not need constant urban crowding to reach rural life. It needed points of contact and enough movement to find them. Once it arrived, the loss of even a few working adults could change the balance of a household. Labor was one of the most vulnerable resources in a pre-modern crisis. A field required hands at the correct season, and the season did not wait for recovery. If illness took workers at sowing, haymaking, harvest, threshing, milling, or animal care, the damage reached beyond the sickbed. A weakened body meant a delayed task. A delayed task meant a poorer yield. A poorer yield meant less food for the next winter. The plague therefore struck not only lives, but calendars. War made the narrowing margin worse. In Italy, the Gothic War had turned cities and countryside into a long struggle between Justinian's forces and the Ostrogothic kingdom. The war did not unfold as a single clean campaign. It became a sequence of sieges, movements, negotiations, shortages, reversals, and shifting control. Rome itself changed hands more than once, and Ravenna, Naples, and other centers drew soldiers and civilians into the hard arithmetic of defense and supply. A city under pressure could not feed itself by courage. Belisarius moved through this Italian world as an imperial commander whose success depended on more than battlefield skill. He needed ships, provisions, loyalties, local cooperation, fortified places, and the willingness or exhaustion of towns. His career shows how 6th century power was always logistical before it was glorious. A general could be praised in histories, but the army behind him required grain, fodder, transport, and payment. When climate stress and disease strained those supplies, strategy became more fragile. For ordinary Italians, imperial restoration could feel less like a return of order than another demand placed upon a damaged land. Gothic rulers required support, imperial armies required support, cities required supply. Rural producers bore the weight in fields, animals, carts, taxes, rents, requisitions, and risk. One authority might promise protection against another, but protection still needed bread. When two powers fought over a region, the peasant's field did not double its yield to feed both. The same decade that saw plague also saw the continuation of cold and political strain. Around 540, modern evidence points to another major volcanic event, adding further pressure to a climate system already disturbed. Ancient people did not experience these things as separate entries in a scientific timeline. They lived them as a sequence of difficult years, strange light, weak harvests, war, sickness, rising demands, and the thinning of trust. The calendar moved forward, but recovery kept being interrupted. A bishop in such conditions stood between explanation and administration. He could preach repentance, organize prayer, distribute alms, negotiate with rulers, protect church property, and speak for the poor when power allowed. During plague, his responsibilities could widen further. Burial, consolation, discipline, charity, and the maintenance of communal worship under fear. The bishop did not possess modern public health, but he possessed authority, buildings, stores, scribes, clergy, and a language that made suffering intelligible. People came to the church because it was one of the few institutions that could still gather meaning and material help in the same place. Monasteries faced a similar double burden. Their rules ordered prayer and labor, but crisis asked more from both. Hospitality might bring the hungry and the sick. Stores might need to be opened. Fields still needed tending. Books still required copying if the work of preservation was to continue. The monastery could seem sheltered because it was regulated, yet regulation was not isolation. The house of monks stood in a landscape of patrons, tenants, travelers, servants, animals, crops, roads, and obligations. Markets under plague and war became even more unstable. A shortage of labor could affect production. A dangerous road could affect supply. A frightened buyer might hold coin for food. A merchant might avoid a troubled district or raise prices to account for risk. A ruler might requisition grain before it reached ordinary sale. An epidemic did not need to close every stall to disturb value. It only needed to make trust more difficult. Debt deepened where crisis lasted. A household that had borrowed during the cold years might borrow again after illness. Land could pass from weaker families to stronger patrons. Dependence could become formal where it had once been temporary. A person who had entered service for food might find it harder to leave. A monastery or aristocratic estate that could feed people might gain labor, loyalty, land, or moral authority. Relief and power were often bound together in the same act. The poor again appear mostly through the words of others. Sermons tell the wealthy to give. Chronicles mention famine or pestilence. Laws and letters reveal administrative concern. Graves and settlement changes give material hints. Yet the structure of the crisis makes their vulnerability clear. A poor household could not wait out price changes easily. It could not replace an ox easily. It could not lose a worker easily. It could not travel far without risk. Its resources were near, visible, and quickly exhausted. Children and elders carried the crisis in different ways. Children depended on others for food, warmth, and protection, and a hungry childhood could leave marks beyond the year itself. Elders carried memory of earlier seasons, kinship ties, skills, and authority within the household. yet their physical vulnerability could become severe under hunger or disease. Formal records rarely pause over these intimate facts. History has to approach them gently through the demands placed on the household as a unit. The family was the first hospital, granary and refuge most people knew. Burial brought private grief into communal order. Christian communities treated burial as an act of mercy and hope, and cemeteries held the dead within a sacred geography of memory. During periods of higher mortality, burial practice could strain under numbers, fear, labor shortage, or disrupted clergy. The important historical point does not require lingering over physical detail. It is enough to see that death, too, required work, carrying, digging, praying, marking, remembering, and returning to the living tasks that could not be left undone. The plague also changed how people understood divine time. A strange sun might be a sign. A failed harvest might be punishment or warning. A great sickness after years of cold could make the world feel morally charged in every direction. Bishops and chroniclers did not separate environment, body, and soul into the categories modern explanation prefers. They lived inside a cosmos where disaster demanded interpretation. Repentance, charity, processions, relics, and prayer remained ways of acting within that interpretation. Yet, practical intelligence continued beside theology. People avoided certain places when they feared them. They watched patterns of sickness. They noticed whether travelers brought danger. They sought remedies, rest, food, blessings, and distance where possible. They cared for kin and sometimes fled from contact. Their explanations were not modern, but their responses were not empty. Human beings had always learned from fear, even when they could not name the cause correctly. The imperial state tried to continue because states are built to continue. Laws were issued, armies campaigned, taxes were demanded, buildings rose, officials wrote. Justinian's reign, despite plague and war, remained one of immense legal and architectural ambition. The great church of Hagia Sophia had been completed only shortly before the plague reached Constantinople. Its dome, lit by windows and praised by contemporaries, belonged to the same reign that struggled with darkness, hunger, disease, and war. Grandeur and fragility lived under one emperor. That coexistence matters. The 6th century was not a simple descent from light into ruin. It was a century of building and breaking, copying and losing, conquering and exhausting, praying and taxing, feeding and failing to feed. People did not experience it as a single lesson. They experienced it as tasks set before them by each morning. Find bread, keep warmth, obey or avoid power, tend the sick, work the field, repair the roof, answer the creditor, bury the dead, listen for news. In northern regions, the plague's pattern is harder to trace with the same confidence as in the Mediterranean, but the wider century still carried climate stress, settlement change, and social rearrangement. Some communities may have become more dependent on stronger households. Some marginal places may have been abandoned. Some elites may have used feasting, gift-giving, and display to hold followers through uncertainty. Where written sources thinned, archaeology carried the burden of witness. A repaired hall and a deserted farm could belong to the same century of strain. The narrowing margin was therefore not one event. It was the reduction of options across many parts of life. Less grain, weaker animals, more expensive movement, greater dependence, disease moving through contact, war demanding supply, authority becoming both necessary and burdensome. Religious explanation growing stronger because ordinary explanation no longer seemed large enough. A society can continue under such pressure, but continuation itself becomes more costly. After plague and war had joined the cold years, Europe did not emerge unchanged. Some institutions gained weight because they could preserve order, memory, charity, or land. Some households lost ground they would not regain. Some cities shrank in confidence or capacity. Some regions shifted their settlement patterns. The old Roman world did not vanish in one blow, but its remains were rearranged under stress. The century kept moving, and movement changed what could survive. From this narrowing margin, the story turns toward what endured. Not a clean recovery, not a triumphant return to the world before 536, and not a simple collapse into darkness. What remained was more uneven than that. Churches with fuller authority, monasteries with deeper memory, rulers with altered demands, fields worked again under changed conditions, roads still crossed in fragments, and people who learned to live after years when the sky, the harvest, and the body had all seemed less dependable than before. Chapter 14. What remained after the dim years, after the cold years? Europe did not return to the world that had existed before them. No bell rang across the continent to announce that the crisis had passed. No ruler stood before all the peoples of the former Roman West and declared recovery complete. The change was slower, rougher, and more uneven. Some fields were sown again, some animals were bred again, some roads carried carts again. Some households rebuilt their stores by careful increments, while others never regained the land, livestock, tools, or independence they had lost when the margin narrowed. A crisis leaves traces in what survives and in what disappears. A farm that remained occupied tells one kind of story. A settlement that contracted tells another. A monastery that copied books through troubled decades tells another still. In the written record, 536 and the years around it appear as strange signs: failed bread, plague, war, and fear. In the environmental record, they appear as narrow rings, volcanic traces, and altered growth. In ordinary life, they would have appeared as smaller inheritances, weaker obligations, remembered hunger, new dependence, and old routines resumed with less certainty than before. The phrase Dark Age often tries to make these centuries sound empty, but emptiness is not what the evidence shows. The 6th century was crowded with institutions, memories, skills, and ambitions. Justinian's government issued laws, built churches, and sent armies across the sea. Gothic and Frankish rulers negotiated power through land, war, family, and oath. Bishops preached, judged, wrote, protected property, organized charity, and gave communities a language for suffering. Monasteries preserved texts, cultivated fields, received guests, and slowly gathered the authority that would shape later medieval Europe. The age was difficult, but it was not vacant. What had changed was the balance between inheritance and endurance. Roman roads still crossed the land, but not all were maintained with Roman strength. Roman law still shaped thought and practice, but it passed through Gothic, Frankish, ecclesiastical, and local hands. Roman cities still stood, though many were smaller, poorer, or governed by different powers. Latin learning did not vanish, but it increasingly depended on churches and monasteries for preservation. The Old World remained, not as a complete structure, but as material to be reused. A wall stone could be taken from a Roman building and set into a later house. A road built for imperial movement could carry a bishop's letter or a peasant's cart. A legal formula shaped in the empire could appear in a royal grant to a church. A book copied in a monastery could preserve words written under a different political sky. Continuity in this world rarely meant that things stayed unchanged. It meant that older forms were taken up by new hands. For households, survival after the crisis was less dramatic than the crisis itself, but no less important. The next harvest had to be brought in. Seed had to be restored, animals had to be bred from what remained, tools had to be repaired or replaced, children had to be fed into strength, debts had to be answered or carried, marriages, inheritances, and service relationships had to be arranged in a world where some families had lost more than others. Recovery was work spread across years. Those who had stores during the hard years could emerge with greater power. A monastery that fed dependents might gain loyalty, gifts, or land. A landholder who lent seed might later claim more labor or stronger rights. A patron who protected a household could deepen that household's dependence. Charity and power were not always separate forces. In a hungry century, the hand that gave bread might also become the hand that received obedience. Churches gained weight, partly because they stood where many forms of need met. They held property. They received gifts. They preserved records. They buried the dead. They gathered the living. They spoke of judgment and mercy in the same breath. When rulers changed, a bishop's seat could remain. When families lost status, a church archive might preserve a grant. When plague or famine passed through a region, prayer, burial, almsgiving and memory made the church one of the places where the event became part of communal history. Monasteries deepened that process in a quieter way. A monastic house could be a farm, school, storehouse, guest house, archive, and place of prayer at once. Its order of life gave time a shape that did not depend entirely on politics outside its walls. The copying of books preserved more than theology. It preserved grammar, law, history, medicine, letters, and habits of attention inherited from the Roman and Christian past. A page copied in such a place could outlast a kingdom's boundary. Cassiodorus's movement from public office into monastic preservation captures something essential about the century. He had served Gothic rulers in Italy using the language of Roman administration. Later, at Vivarium, he imagined a disciplined Christian scholarship that could protect books from neglect and loss. His life did not solve the crisis of the age, but it shows one answer to it. When political structures became uncertain, memory could be housed in study, rule, and copying. Benedict's rule offers another answer. It did not describe an empire. It described a community ordered by prayer, work, obedience, moderation, reading, food, clothing, sleep, discipline, and care. Such a rule mattered because it translated large uncertainty into daily structure. Under a cold sky, after famine, amid plague and war, a life divided by bells and tasks could become one of the strongest forms of continuity. The monastery did not escape history. It gave history a schedule. Rulers also adapted. Frankish power continued to grow in Gaul, not as a modern state, but as a network of royal households, aristocratic loyalties, episcopal alliances, landholding, and military force. The Merovingian world absorbed Roman remnants and reshaped them through its own customs. Kings granted land to churches, fought relatives, rewarded followers, and moved through territories where authority had to be seen to be believed. The cold years did not create that system, but they unfolded inside it and tested its capacity to gather resources. Italy's path was harsher in many places because war layered itself over climate and disease. Justinian's attempt to restore imperial rule in the west drained strength from the peninsula even as it briefly reattached parts of it to Constantinople's authority. Cities suffered, fields were disrupted, and political control shifted under military pressure. To speak of reconquest as an imperial achievement is not wrong, but it is incomplete. For many who lived through it, reconquest meant another demand on bread, walls, roads, and bodies. The plague's aftermath was equally uneven. Some communities lost many people, others were touched less clearly in the surviving record. Labor shortages, disrupted households, abandoned lands, changed rents, altered charity, and renewed religious fear may all have followed in different measures depending on region. The great disease never leaves only graves. It leaves changed obligations among the living. Someone must inherit, remarry, take over work, abandon a field, adopt a child, claim a tool, reopen a market, or remember a name in prayer. Northern Europe continued along paths that are harder to narrate in continuous words. Archaeology carries much of the story there, settlements shifting, halls rising or falling, graves changing, animal remains accumulating, pollen settling in wet ground, and imported goods appearing where trade still reached. Some northern societies may have responded to stress by concentrating power more strongly around elites who could feed, protect, and reward followers. Others may have adapted through movement, abandonment of marginal land, or changes in farming and exchange. The evidence remains regional, patient, and incomplete. Climate itself did not act like a ruler issuing the same command everywhere. A colder summer in one place might mean failed grain. In another, it might mean poorer hay. Elsewhere, it might mean delayed ripening, weaker animals, higher prices, or a shorter fishing season. Local ecology mattered, so did wealth, storage, transport, charity, political protection, and access to alternative food. The same sky could produce different histories beneath it. That is why the year 536 is best understood not as a single worst moment, but as the opening of a pressure that revealed how people lived. It revealed dependence on grain. It revealed the value of animals. It revealed the importance of roofs, roads, bishops, markets, records, and stored food. It revealed how quickly a household could be pushed toward a patron. It revealed how strongly religious explanation could organize public fear. It revealed that the old Roman world had ended in some ways and endured in others. The people of 536 did not know they were living inside a famous year. They did not know that later scholars would compare tree rings, ice cores, chronicles, and volcanic chemistry. They did not know that their dim sun would become a subject of climate history. They knew the field in front of them, the animals they had to feed, the debt that might be demanded, the store that might not last, the church bell, the road, the sickbed, the grave, the next season. History becomes large afterward. Life is lived at hand. Even the witnesses did not possess the whole pattern. Procopius saw enough to record a sun without brightness, but he could not see the full chain of eruptions and cooling. An Irish analyst could record bread failure without mapping hemispheric climate. A monk copying an old notice could not know which future reader would place it beside a tree ring. A bishop preaching repentance could not know how modern scholars would speak of aerosols. Each witness held a fragment, and the fragments became clearer only when time had gathered them. There is a gentleness in that, though not a sentimental one. The past often survives without intending to. A tree grows as it can, and its ring remains. A scribe copies a line, and the line travels. A road is repaired enough for another cart. A roof is patched before another rain. A child survives a hungry season, and later becomes an elder who remembers that bread once failed. A field is sown again because there is nothing else for a household to do. The dim years passed, but they did not vanish. They remained in weakened estates, altered settlements, stronger churches, copied records, changed dependencies, and stories of strange weather. They remained in the way later generations inherited a Europe less Roman in its Western politics and more medieval in its local institutions. They remained in the slow transfer of memory from civic office to monastery, from imperial road to regional route, from public grain systems to local charity and patronage. The world after 536 was not new, but it was less able to pretend it was the old one. A page, a field, and a beam of timber can carry more history than they seem to carry. The page keeps the line about the sun. The field keeps the labor of those who returned after hunger. The beam keeps the mark of a tree that grew narrowly in a cold season and was later cut, shaped, lifted, and set into use. None of these things explains the whole century. Together, they give the century a body. So the story of 536 settles not in one catastrophe, but in many continuities under strain. Bread was baked again. Bells sounded again. Roads took footsteps again. Ships left harbors again. Children learned the names of saints and kings from elders who had lived through dimmer seasons. Monks bent over pages. Farmers watched the sky. Bishops spoke of mercy. Rulers still asked for loyalty. Animals still had to be fed before winter. The darkness, where it had been seen, became memory. The cold, where it had bitten into harvests and herds, became rings in wood and entries in records. The plague, where it passed, became burial, prayer, inheritance, and absence. The wars became ruined walls, changed rulers, and stories told by those who survived them. Europe did not wake from the year 536 into comfort. It continued, which is a quieter and harder thing. In the end, the age often called dark was filled with people trying to keep small lights of order alive. A store of grain, a copied book, a roof mended before rain, a law remembered, a road still followed, a prayer repeated, a child fed, a field worked again after failure. No single light was enough to master the century. Many were enough to keep life moving through it. And farther away from every household, beyond the roofs, fields, roads, churches, ports, and northern halls, the trees continued their slow record. Each year laid down its narrow mark or wider one, without fear, without explanation, without choosing what to remember. In the cold years, the rings tightened. In better seasons, they widened again. Long after the people of 536 were gone, the wood still held the measure of those summers, quiet beneath bark, waiting for another age to read what the sky had once done. The journey is complete. Rest well.